The valley looked peaceful. That was the lie that killed them. 280 Marines walked into Blackwater Valley at 0612 on a Tuesday morning, weapons ready, eyes forward, completely unaware that every ridge above them had been mapped, measured, and weaponized. The enemy had been waiting for 11 days. They had studied the patrol routes, calculated the angles, pre-positioned their mortars. They weren't setting an ambush. They were building a coffin. And the Marines just walked inside it. If this story grips you, follow my channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Ethan Walker noticed when they entered the valley was the silence. Not quiet, silence. The specific wrong kind that doesn't belong to a place that should have birds, wind, the distant shuffle of goats, or the bark of a dog in some hidden village. Blackwater Valley should have had all of those things. The intelligence briefing said it was low-density, semi-rural, sporadically inhabited by farming families who moved with the season. Instead, there was nothing. No birdsong. No breeze moving through the scrub grass on the eastern slope. No sound at all except for the boots of 280 Marines, their gear rattling in subtle rhythms that felt deafeningly loud inside the silence. Ethan slowed his pace without realizing it. He was a commander, 11 years in, 3 combat deployments, 2 awards for valor that he kept in a shoebox under his bunk because looking at them made him uncomfortable. He had walked into hard places before. He knew what danger smelled like. He knew the particular way a battlefield held its breath before it exhaled violence. This felt like that. Walker. His radio operator, Corporal Denny Marsh, appeared at his left shoulder. 23 years old, patches of sunburn across his nose, always chewing the same brand of wintergreen gum that he'd been hoarding since Ramstein. Lieutenant Reeves wants to know if you want to hold position at the 300 marker. Tell Reeves to hold his people tight, stack intervals. Ethan kept scanning the ridgeline to the north. The terrain was a textbook kill zone if you knew how to read it, and someone clearly did. The valley narrowed toward the south like a funnel, wide enough at the mouth to absorb a large element, constrictive enough in the middle that lateral movement became impossible. What's our air asset status? Command has a Predator up but feeds intermittent. Signal dropout started about 40 minutes ago. Marsh paused. They said the terrain's probably interfering. Or someone's jamming it. Marsh looked at him. Sir? Ethan didn't answer. He raised his hand and signaled a temporary hold. All along the column, 280 men slowed and crouched, weapons up, training taking over before conscious thought could catch up. He pulled out his map, actual paper, laminated, worn at the folds, and studied the valley's contour lines. They were 300 meters in. The valley extended another 600 meters south to the river crossing. The ridges on both sides were marked as unoccupied. He didn't believe that anymore. He keyed his radio. Falcon 6, this is Walker, requesting grid confirmation on Northern Ridge, Sector Delta 3. How recent is the last sweep? Static. Then, Walker, last SIGINT sweep was 72 hours ago. Grid reads clear. 72 hours. 3 days. In a contested mountain zone, 3 days was an eternity. Push Mendez and his squad to the eastern slope, Ethan said quietly to Marsh. 200 meters. I want eyes on that ridgeline. Command's going to ask why we're deviating. Tell them I want a visual on the terrain. Marsh started to reach for his radio. And that was the exact moment the valley stopped being quiet. The first burst came from the north ridge. Not a shot. A burst. Full automatic, sustained, ripping through the morning air with the specific sound of a heavy machine gun that had been set up, bore-sighted, and positioned by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The rounds hit the column's center before anyone could react. 3 Marines dropped. A 4th spun sideways and went down, grabbing his shoulder. The sound echoed off the valley walls and fractured into layers, so that for the first half-second it was impossible to tell which direction was taking fire. Then the western ridge opened up. And then the east. The valley didn't erupt into chaos. That was the terrifying part. It was coordinated, synchronized. 3 separate firing positions opening in a calculated sequence, overlapping their arcs so that there was no safe direction to move. Mortars followed 8 seconds later, walking down the valley floor in pairs, the blasts tossing dirt and rock and equipment into the air in slow, ugly geysers. Marines hit the ground and started returning fire. Training and muscle memory filled the gap where thought couldn't function yet. Suppressive fire went uphill in all three directions. Voices started screaming. Commands, updates, the specific hoarse sound of men calling for a medic. Ethan was already moving before he consciously decided to move. "Contact north, east, and west," he shouted into his radio, trying to keep his voice level and failing by maybe 10%. "We have a three-sided engagement, valley position, grid 447-332. I need CAS immediately. Repeat, immediately. We are taking coordinated fire. Walker, confirm your grid. 447-332. Blackwater Valley main axis. They're on all three ridges. We are in a kill box. Get me air support, now." The radio filled with overlapping transmissions. Command was trying to process information faster than information was arriving. Ethan already knew that by the time they sorted it out, the tactical situation would have changed 3 times. He grabbed the nearest squad leader, Sergeant Priya Okafor, a compact woman from Lagos via Philadelphia who had the reputation for thinking clearly under fire. She was pressed against a rock outcropping that was eroding fast under machine gun impacts, chips of stone flying off it in sprays. "Okafor." "I see it," she shouted back. She didn't need him to explain the geometry. She'd seen the same terrain. "We can't go north, east, or west. South is the only axis. The river is 600 meters. We push south in sections. Suppression and move, 20-meter bounds. I need your squad on point." She looked at him with the particular expression that experienced soldiers use when they understand an order is probably going to be brutal but have no better alternative to offer. "On your signal. 10 seconds. Get your people ready." He turned and started organizing the chaos into something that could function. It was like trying to direct water with your hands. Men were scattered along a 200-meter stretch of valley floor, some in cover, some exposed, some trying to drag wounded toward anything that provided protection. The noise was total. Machine guns, mortars, return fire from 280 rifles, and machine guns, men shouting, the flat crack of rounds passing overhead close enough to feel. A mortar round landed 12 meters to Ethan's left. The blast knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, tasted blood, lay still for 2 seconds while his ears screamed and his vision strobed. Then he pushed himself up. Corporal Marsh was still with him, somehow, pressed flat against the ground with his radio handset crushed against his ear, shouting grid coordinates into it with blood running down the side of his face from a cut above his ear. "Marsh," Ethan grabbed his arm. "You good?" Functional. Marsh's eyes were clear even if his face wasn't. "CAS is 15 minutes out. Command says hold position." Hold position. Ethan looked at the valley, at the mortar rounds walking methodically toward their center of mass, at the machine gun fire that was suppressing any attempt to establish a stable firing line. "We hold position for 15 minutes and we won't have a position left to hold." "That's what I told them." "What did they say?" Marsh's expression was answer enough. But Ethan had studied ambush tactics in school and refined his understanding of them in practice over 11 years. He knew the textbook versions: L-shaped, V-shaped, linear, complex. He had been in ambushes before, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in a training environment that had gone badly wrong in ways that still occasionally appeared in his dreams. But this was different. This was something he had only read about in historical accounts and after-action reports. This was a deliberate, pre-planned annihilation attempt, not an ambush designed to inflict casualties and withdraw. This was designed to destroy an entire element with no survivors and no witnesses. The evidence was in the details. The 3-sided coverage with no gaps. The mortar positioning that was adjusted in real time, not pre-registered. The timing of the initial bursts, simultaneous, which required either direct visual coordination between the 3 positions or radio communication that had been active and rehearsed. Someone had spent days or weeks setting this up. Someone had known the patrol route, the timeline, the approximate size of the element entering the valley. Someone had told them. That thought landed in Ethan's mind like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. He filed it away. Survival first. Questions later. If there was a later. "Okafor, move!" he shouted. Her squad broke from cover in tight groups. Two men suppressing while two moved, leapfrogging south in bounds that covered ground while trying not to expose anyone for more than a few seconds. Other squads followed in sequence. The movement was ragged and cost them. Two men went down in the first 50 meters, one hit in the leg, one in the back. Corpsmen got to one of them. The other lay still. The valley floor was a terrible place to move. It was too open, the sparse vegetation offering nothing meaningful as cover. The rocky soil disrupted by mortar craters that created obstacles as much as concealment. Marines were navigating around craters, over rocks, across ground that had been turned into an obstacle course by sustained fire. And the fire didn't stop. What it did do, gradually, was shift. Ethan noticed it after the first 100 meters. The Eastern Ridge's machine gun went quiet for 30 seconds. Barrel change, ammunition resupply, or a crew problem, impossible to tell which. And in that window, the suppression on the right flank dropped enough for two squads to make faster progress than the column average. He exploited it instinctively, directing Okafor's element to push harder right, while the gap existed. "They're adjusting south," Marsh relayed from his radio. "The northern positions are shifting their fire to keep up with us." They expected us to stay in place longer. Ethan processed this. Or they're trying to hurt us. Hurt us where? He looked south, toward the river, toward the exit he'd been assuming was a salvation. "I don't know yet," he said, which was honest in a way that he didn't like. "Kit." Staff Sergeant Carlos Reeve, no relation to Lieutenant Reeves, a confusion that had been comic during training and was irrelevant now, ran the heavy weapons section with the kind of precise obsession that made him occasionally insufferable in garrison and extraordinarily effective in the field. He had 4 machine gun teams, 2 of which had already lost their primary gunners in the first 2 minutes of contact. He had requisitioned the guns himself, reorganized teams on the fly, and established the best suppressive fire platform the broken terrain allowed. He found Ethan during a brief lull in the mortar cadence, crouched behind a boulder with a map in one hand and a radio handset in the other. "Commander," Reeves' voice was flat and businesslike, the way men get when they've processed that they're in serious trouble and decided to be useful about it. "I've got a problem with the Eastern Ridge. Tell me." "There's a secondary position up there, higher than the one we're taking fire from, maybe 300 meters above it. I can't see it, but I can read the trajectory of the rounds." He pointed at the rock face behind them, where impacts had created a distinctive pattern. "The angle's wrong for the lower position. Something's firing from elevation." Ethan looked where he was pointing. Reeve was right. He could see it now, the way the impacts came in at a steeper angle than the visible firing position could account for. "How many, you think?" "Team. Maybe 2 teams." Reeve paused. "And I think they've got a spotter. The mortars are adjusting too accurately. Someone up high is calling corrections. A spotter. Someone watching the entire valley floor, feeding corrections to mortar crews, turning the random chaos of combat into a managed, systematic process of elimination." "Can you range the upper position?" "Not without better cover and better angles." Reeves' jaw was tight. "I'm telling you so you know. The mortars aren't going to stop getting better. They're getting more accurate every time they adjust." Ethan absorbed this. "Stay on your guns. Keep pressure on the ridge lines. Make them keep their heads down. That's the priority." "Yes, sir." Reeves started to leave, then turned back. "Commander, we've got 14 wounded, and I'm counting 4 KIA. We've been in contact 9 minutes. 9 minutes. Ethan had known it was bad. Hearing the number made it concrete in a way that the chaos of the valley floor hadn't quite managed. 4 dead, 14 wounded, in 9 minutes. At this rate, they would cease to be an effective fighting force long before air support arrived. "Keep moving south," he said. "Don't stop." The river appeared at 6:43. Ethan had been clinging to it as a concept for 17 minutes. The river, the crossing, the exit from the valley where the terrain opened up and the funnel widened and the 3-sided geometry of the kill box ceased to apply. He had organized his mind around it as a fixed point of hope during the long, brutal minutes of fighting south through the valley. When he saw it, the hope didn't disappear exactly. It just changed shape into something he didn't recognize. The Callahan River, which the intelligence maps showed as a crossable waterway, knee-to-waist deep, manageable even under pressure, had been transformed. Recent mountain snowmelt, upstream runoff, possibly deliberate upstream manipulation, had turned it into something else entirely. It was wide where it should have been narrow. It was fast where it should have been slow. It was loud in the way of water that has mass and momentum and will accept no argument from anything in its path. The crossing points marked on his map were gone. The shallow ford at grid 447-325 was underwater, the submerged rocks visible as dark shapes moving in the current. The emergency crossing point 300 meters downstream was a churning mess of white water and debris. Branches, wood, what looked like part of a fence, moving at speed. Ethan stood at the bank for about 3 seconds before a mortar round landed 40 meters behind him and reminded him that standing still in the open was a luxury he couldn't afford. He pulled back behind cover, a dense cluster of riverside boulders partially concealed by the riverbank itself, and tried to make a decision with incomplete information, incoming fire, and a diminishing force. "Sir?" Lieutenant Reeves appeared beside him, face grim. "Tell me there's a plan." "There will be." That's not as reassuring as, "Reeves." Ethan looked at him. "Give me 30 seconds. Reeves closed his mouth. The river was uncrossable in the conventional sense. Wading was possible in theory. Men could fight the current if they had good footing and weren't already exhausted and wounded and under fire. But getting 280 men across, including 14 who couldn't walk under their own power, while taking fire from 3 ridges, the casualty rate would be catastrophic. But they couldn't go back through the valley. That was a slower version of the same death. "Rope systems," Ethan said. "We anchor 2 ropes across, 1 hand line, 1 safety. Engineers in the water first, we get the lines across and tensioned, then we move wounded first." "Under fire." "Under fire." He looked at the river. "And we suppress those ridge lines harder than we've been suppressing them. I need every machine gun we have focused on keeping their heads down long enough to get ropes across and start the flow. That'll burn through our ammunition faster, I know. We're already running low on—" "I know, Reeves." His voice was quiet. Not angry, quiet in the particular way that ends discussions. "It's the only play we have. Get your element ready to go in the water on my signal." Reeves looked at the river, then at the ridgelines, then at his commander. "Yes, sir." But getting the ropes across took 11 minutes and cost 2 more men. The engineers, 6 of them, combat veterans with specific training in field-expedient water crossing, worked in pairs, moving laterally along the bank to find the narrowest defensible point, then going into the water while their teammates laid suppressive fire up the slopes. The current was brutal. The first pair made it across in a ragged, gasping struggle that carried them 20 meters downstream before they found footing on the far bank. One of them went under twice and came up coughing both times. The second pair didn't make it. The river took the junior man, Private First Class Danny Ortega, 21 years old from Tucson, who'd been in the unit for 8 months and was known for his ability to mimic the captain's Boston accent, somewhere in the middle of the crossing. His partner tried to hold him but lost his grip in the current. Ortega went under and didn't come back up. His partner made it to the far bank and sat there for several seconds, just breathing, before he started pulling the rope taut. The lines went up. The crossing started. Wounded first. Moving a man who couldn't use his legs across a rope over a fast river, under fire, required 4 men minimum and left all of them exposed for 90 seconds to 2 minutes during the crossing. It was 90 seconds of helplessness while machine gun rounds chipped the rocks around them and mortars continued their slow, patient walk across the valley. They lost more men at the crossing, some to fire, one to the river, a Marine who'd been hit in the shoulder, whose grip failed halfway across when the pain overwhelmed his ability to hold. His name was Corporal James Whitfield. He'd told Ethan 3 weeks ago, during a quiet evening at the FOB, that he was planning to propose to his girlfriend when they rotated home. Ethan watched him go under and kept moving, because that was the only thing he could do. Wait. By 7:41, the surviving element, 231 men, with 22 wounded and 19 dead confirmed, had crossed to the far bank. They were wet, cold, exhausted, and running desperately low on ammunition after an hour of sustained fire. The eastern ridgeline was still active. The northern position had shifted its angle of fire and was still reaching them across the river. And on the far bank, where the intelligence maps showed open terrain and a clear withdrawal route to the extraction point, there were enemy fighters. Not as many as the ridge positions, but enough. Positioned at the tree line's edge, waiting for the crossing to create the chaos they needed, beginning to probe the perimeter with probing fire that tested for gaps. Ethan stood at the center of what remained of his unit and did the math that commanders do when the math is all they have left. They couldn't push through the fighters to the south, not at this ammunition state. They couldn't go back across the river. The valley behind them was still covered by the ridge positions. The far bank tree line was closing in. They were not out of the kill box. They were in the second room of it. Marsh appeared at his shoulder. His radio was crackling with transmissions from command, from other units trying to understand the situation, from a dozen conversations happening simultaneously as the information about what was happening in Blackwater Valley propagated outward through the network. "Commander," Marsh's voice had taken on a very specific quality, the kind of deliberate calm that people use when they have news that is going to land hard. "I've got something." "Give it." "There's a transmission, personal radio, satellite uplink. It's authenticating on a military frequency." Marsh paused. "It's using your sister's call sign." Ethan went very still. "Emma," he said. "Yes, sir." Marsh held out the handset. "She's coming through, and sir, she says she's already inside the mountain approach. She's been moving since 0400. Emma Walker, Navy combat medic. His younger sister by 3 years, who had somehow, through channels he couldn't begin to reconstruct in the current moment, learned where he was and what had happened and had made a decision that he knew immediately was irreversible because she had always been like that, decisive in ways that didn't wait for permission. He took the handset, and at that exact moment, on the southern edge of the tree line, the enemy fighters stopped probing and began a sustained push toward the perimeter. The encirclement was complete. On 3 sides, the ring was closing, and the only person moving toward them was moving alone, on foot, through mountain terrain that had just been proven lethal, carrying 42 pounds of medical gear and no weapon except the certainty that her brother's men were dying. The sniper on the upper eastern ridge had begun repositioning. He had seen the satellite radio transmission. He knew someone was coming. The handset was cold in Ethan's palm. Static crackled through it in waves, broken by the sound of wind and breathing and the distant percussion of a world that hadn't erupted yet. "Emma." He said her name again, quieter this time. Not a question, almost like a warning. Her voice came back clear enough to recognize, distorted enough to hurt. "I'm at the second ridgeline, north-northwest approach, coming down the goat trail on the backside of the elevation. I've got visual on your smoke from the crossing. You need to stop moving. That's not happening. Emma." "Ethan." "How many wounded?" He closed his eyes for half a second. Behind him, the sound of suppressive fire was building again as the fighters in the southern tree line pushed harder against the perimeter. Someone was shouting about ammunition. Someone else was shouting about a gap in the line near the river bend. 22, he said. 6 critical. A pause. Not hesitation, she was calculating. He knew the difference. "What's your medical asset on site?" 2 corpsmen. One's been hit. The other's been working for 90 minutes straight. I've got blood, IV lines, surgical pack, airway kit. I can be at your position in 40 minutes if the trail holds. The trail goes through exposed terrain on the eastern approach. I know, I looked at the map. There's a sniper element on the upper eastern ridge. Marsh thinks they repositioned in the last 20 minutes. Another pause, longer this time. How confident is Marsh? Ethan looked at Marsh, who was listening to the exchange with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else entirely. 70%, Marsh said. 70%, Ethan relayed. That's not 100. Emma. I'm not stopping, Ethan. Tell me what you need when I get there. He stood with the handset for a moment, looking at the tree line where muzzle flashes were intermittently visible through the undergrowth, at the river behind them still carrying debris downstream, at the faces of the men nearest to him, exhausted, wet, some of them bleeding, all of them doing the specific arithmetic of remaining ammunition versus remaining threat. Chest seals, he finally said. Tension pneumothorax 2 confirmed, and I need someone who can run a surgical airway if it comes to it. I can do all of that. I know you can. He handed the handset back to Marsh. Keep that frequency open. I want 30-second check-ins. Marsh nodded and pressed the radio back to his ear. Ethan turned and walked toward the sound of the firefight. The southern tree line was 40 meters from the riverbank, and the space between them had become a killing ground that neither side could comfortably occupy. The enemy fighters, Ethan counted at least 12 muzzle positions from what he could observe, though the actual number was likely higher, were using the tree line the way his Marines had used the valley boulders. Short exposure, movement between positions, coordinated fire designed to identify and suppress the return fire, rather than simply exchange rounds. These weren't irregular fighters improvising. They moved with discipline. They communicated. When one position drew return fire, another shifted angle to exploit the exposure. It was practiced, and seeing it clearly made the intelligence failure feel even more catastrophic than it already did. Lieutenant Reeves found him crouched behind a fallen tree trunk at the forward edge of the perimeter, watching the pattern. "We've got a problem on the left flank." Reeves' voice was controlled but strained around the edges. "Sergeant Okafor's element is down to 60 rounds per rifle. The machine gun on that side is out. Pull one of Reeves' teams from the riverside. The riverside is still getting ranging fire from the northern ridge position. If we pull one team." Ethan didn't take his eyes off the tree line. "The river fire is harassment. The tree line is the active threat. We concentrate on the active threat." Reeves hesitated for just a moment, long enough to show he had a different opinion, short enough to recognize this wasn't the time to have it. "Yes, sir." He left. Ethan kept watching. The enemy fire had a rhythm to it. 3 to 4 seconds of concentrated bursts from 2 or 3 positions, followed by a brief reduction as they repositioned or managed ammunition, followed by a resumption from slightly different angles. The cycle ran approximately 45 to 60 seconds. It wasn't random, it was managed, which meant it was predictable, which meant it had a vulnerability. The vulnerability was in the reduction phase. During those few seconds when the outgoing fire dropped, there was a window to move. Not far, 10, 15 meters at most before the fire resumed. But in that terrain, 10 meters was the difference between cover and exposure. Ethan found Sergeant Okafor. She was at the left edge of the perimeter, directing her remaining people with hand signals, conserving voice communication because shouting your position was a liability she wasn't willing to accept. "Okafor." He crouched beside her. "I need your squad to push 15 meters into the tree line on my signal." She looked at him the way she always looked at him when she understood an order completely and had reservations about it. "Into the tree line. 15 meters, on the reduction phase, when their outgoing drops. You'll have 4 to 6 seconds. And then we're 15 meters into the tree line with 60 rounds per rifle. And then you've broken their firing line. They'll have to deal with you inside their perimeter instead of engaging us from the outside of ours." He watched her face process this. It's the one thing they're not expecting. Every element in this valley has been reacting, not acting. We act. She was quiet for a few seconds. Not resistant. Thinking. He could always tell the difference with her. "When does the reduction phase hit next?" He looked at his watch. "Approximately 40 seconds. I need 20 to get my people positioned." "You have it." She moved immediately, low and fast, touching shoulders and pointing, her squad reorganizing in silence with the economy of motion that came from doing dangerous things together long enough that communication became mostly physical. Ethan moved back to the center of the line and caught Marsh's eye, signaling for a radio check. "Emma's at checkpoint 2, Marsh said quietly. "Moving faster than estimated. She says the trail's clearer than the map showed." Good news. He almost didn't trust it. "Keep monitoring." Ethan looked down the line. "Tell Reeve I want the heavy gun on the right flank to open up in 30 seconds. Sustained, directed at the tree line center. Draw their attention right." Marsh relayed the order. 30 seconds later, Reeves' machine gun opened with a sustained, deliberate burst that raked the center of the tree line and forced the enemy positions there to suppress or shift. The incoming fire on the left flank dropped. Okafor's squad moved. They went into the tree line like water finding a crack in stone, not loud, not dramatic, just suddenly present where they hadn't been before. The first few seconds were the worst. Open ground between the perimeter and the trees, running hard in short bursts, waiting for the fire to come back and knowing that when it did, someone was going to be caught in it. 2 men were. One took a round through the lower leg and went down 5 meters from the tree line. His partner didn't leave him, grabbed his drag handle, and pulled him the remaining distance in a single brutal effort that left both of them gasping in the undergrowth. The second man's helmet was hit. The round deflected off at an angle that left a gouge in the Kevlar and a ringing in his ears that he'd be dealing with for weeks, if he made it weeks. Both of them made it to the trees. And then Okafor's squad was inside the enemy position, and the dynamic shifted. Close quarters and heavy undergrowth is a particular kind of chaos that experience helps with only slightly. Distances collapse. Identifying friend from enemy becomes a function of uniform and context rather than distance and position. Movement sounds get confused with enemy movement. Training takes over because there isn't time for thought. And what training produces in Okafor's people was controlled aggression, clearing angles, moving in pairs, communicating in short bursts and hand signals. The enemy fighters hadn't expected contact inside their own perimeter. It disrupted their coordination in ways that were immediately visible from Ethan's position. The outgoing fire from the left third of the tree line went chaotic, then sporadic, then stopped as the positions there were dealt with or displaced. The right and center continued, but the geometry had changed. The line that had been continuous was now broken. Ethan used the brake. All elements, push south, bound, and move. Now! The perimeter lurched forward. Marines who had been holding static positions for too long moved with the particular urgency of people who understood that the window they'd been given was temporary. Wounded were carried or dragged. Machine guns displaced forward in pairs. The movement wasn't elegant. It was messy and loud and cost them contact on the riverside as the northern ridge fire intensified briefly to compensate. But they moved. Inside the tree line, Okafor was dealing with a problem she hadn't anticipated. The enemy element in the southern trees was larger than the muzzle count had suggested. What they'd been seeing was the forward line, the direct engagement positions. Behind that forward line was a support element, maybe 8 to 10 fighters, who had been managing ammunition resupply and maintaining communication with the ridge positions. That support element was now reacting to Okafor's intrusion with considerably more organization than she would have preferred. "I've got contact to my south," she transmitted, trying to keep her voice below the level that would carry through the trees. "Second element, 10 plus, they're maneuvering east." Ethan heard it and immediately understood the problem. If the support element moved east, they would flank Okafor's squad while simultaneously cutting off the southern push. He had maybe 90 seconds before that became a crisis he couldn't solve. "Reeves, take your element east, parallel to Okafor's position. Now!" Reeves was already moving. He'd been listening to the transmissions and reading the terrain. His element cut east along the southern edge of the tree line at a jog, making noise that they couldn't avoid, but accepting that noise was the price of speed. The resulting contact was brief, concentrated, and brutal in the way that close-range engagements in heavy cover always are. Reeves's element hit the flanking support group before it completed its maneuver. The exchange lasted less than 3 minutes and left 4 enemy fighters down, and one of Reeves' people with a gunshot wound to the abdomen that was immediately and clearly very serious. Corman Daly, the one who'd been working for 90 minutes straight, was there within seconds. He was operating on training and adrenaline and probably something else that had nothing to do with either, his hands moving through assessment and intervention with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had learned to switch off the part of himself that processed what he was seeing. "He needs a surgeon," Daly said when Ethan reached the position. "Not dramatic, clinical. I can keep him stable for maybe 2 hours. After that..." He shook his head and turned back to his patient. Ethan looked at the man on the ground. Specialist Ray Cobb, 26, from somewhere in Georgia. He'd been in the unit 14 months. He told Ethan once, in the way that young soldiers sometimes confide in commanders when guards are down, that he was planning to apply for officer candidacy when his enlistment was up. "She's coming," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to Cobb, or to Daly, or to himself. "Emma's coming. Baltet." Emma Walker had been moving for 4 hours and 11 minutes. She had a watch on her left wrist that she checked methodically, a habit from field medicine where time management was the difference between interventions that worked and interventions that arrived too late. She had a satellite radio on her right hip, a pack that weighed 42 pounds on her back, and a route that she'd been improvising for the last hour as the terrain refused to cooperate with the intelligence map she'd memorized the night before. The mountain approach from the northwest was the longest way in. It was also the only way that didn't require moving through the valley itself or across open ground that the ridge positions could cover. Emma had identified it by looking at the terrain elevation data for 40 minutes before she'd left. tracing lines on a map with her finger until she found the path that the enemy planners probably hadn't prioritized because it was too long and too difficult for a conventional element. It wasn't too difficult for one person who was willing to move fast and accept the physical cost of that speed. Her legs were burning. Her right knee, which had a scar on it from a training accident 3 years ago that had never quite healed correctly, was sending her a specific kind of message that she was categorically ignoring. The pack was not getting lighter, despite the fact that she'd already moved through 2 of the energy bars she'd packed and drained a liter of water. She was fit, genuinely, practically fit in the way that people who spend time in environments where fitness is survival understand fitness, not as a personal achievement but as a professional requirement. She had been to 3 combat zones in 6 years. She had treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, crush trauma, and burns under conditions that ranged from difficult to outright absurd. She had been decorated twice and had never told her family about either time because the explanations would require more context than she was willing to provide. What she had not done was walk alone through hostile mountain terrain toward an active firefight with 19 dead and 6 critically wounded waiting for her at the other end. She was doing that now. The trail she was on, barely a trail, more of a suggestion of a path left by animals or the occasional herdsman over many years, switchbacked up the northern face of the ridge and then dropped sharply on the southern side toward the river valley. She had been on the descent for 30 minutes, which meant she was losing elevation and getting louder despite her best efforts, the loose rock underfoot shifting and skittering with every step. She stopped. Sound. Below her and to the right, maybe 150 meters. Not weapon fire. She'd been tracking the fire from a distance, and this wasn't that. This was movement. Careful movement. Someone trying to be quiet and not quite achieving it. Emma pressed herself against the rock face and waited. The movement continued. Deliberate, methodical, moving uphill at an angle that would intersect the trail she was on approximately 60 meters ahead. 1 person, possibly 2. Not a large element. The sound signature was wrong for anything bigger than a pair. She controlled her breathing the way she'd been taught, counting silently, and made a rapid assessment. Options. Stay still and let whatever was moving pass below her. Move back uphill and find an alternate route. Or push forward fast and get past the intersection point before whoever was moving reached it. Going back cost time she didn't have. She pushed forward. The next 60 meters she covered in 90 seconds, moving as fast as she could while keeping her footfalls controlled, picking her line carefully, accepting that she was probably audible, and deciding that speed mattered more than silence right now. She made it past the intersection point and pressed herself into a cut in the rock face, going still, controlling her breathing again. Below her and behind her, the movement continued uphill. It passed the trail intersection and continued on a different path, moving northeast, away from her position. She waited 30 seconds after the sound faded before she started moving again. Her heart rate, she noticed clinically, was elevated beyond what the physical exertion accounted for. She acknowledged this as data and filed it away. She reached the visual range of the river valley at 0823. The firefight was still active, reduced in intensity from whatever it had been at peak, based on the sound signature she'd been tracking for the last hour, but not finished. She could see smoke from multiple points. She could see the river. She could see a rough perimeter at the edge of the southern tree line, and when she glassed it with the compact binoculars she'd packed, she could identify it as friendly. She keyed her radio. "Ethan, I have visual on your position. I'm on the northern approach, elevated approximately 400 meters north of the river." His voice came back with something in it that she didn't examine too carefully. "I see your elevation. What's the terrain between you and the water?" She scanned it. Rocky slope, transitioning to brush, transitioning to the riverbank. Open in sections. Not great, but workable. Exposed in 2 sections, maybe 30-40 meters each. The northern ridge position is still active. They've been intermittent for the last 20 minutes, but they're still up there. How intermittent? Rounds every 3 to 4 minutes. She calculated. Moving through the 2 open sections at a good pace would take 15 to 20 seconds each. If the ridge position was cycling at 3 to 4 minutes, the statistical probability of overlapping with an active firing window was manageable. Not comfortable. Manageable. "I'm going to move on your call," she said. "Tell me when you have a suppression window on the northern ridge." A pause. "That'll take me 2 minutes to set up. I'll wait." She used the 2 minutes to inventory her pack and plan her triage sequence. 6 critical. She was working from Ethan's assessment, which might be optimistic or pessimistic depending on how well the corpsman had kept up with the battlefield deterioration. She had blood, 2 units of O negative packed in an insulated sleeve. IV supplies for 4 patients, surgical airway kit, chest seal kit, tourniquet stock, hemostatic gauze. Enough to make a meaningful difference, not enough to fix everything. It never was. Walker, this is Reeve. We're ready on the northern suppression. On your mark. She stood up. Mark. The northern ridge position lit up with return fire from below. Reeve's team pouring rounds uphill, forcing the enemy crew to suppress or take casualties. She moved. The first open section was 32 meters of rocky slope with sparse cover. She covered it at a dead run, pack bouncing, knee sending its messages, focusing on her footing because a twisted ankle here was a death sentence for the people waiting below. She made it to the brush line and went down without stopping, catching herself on both hands and rolling into the scrub, controlling the impact. Incoming fire from the north ridge went above her. Too high. Reeve's suppression was working, pushing the aim off. She waited 3 seconds and moved again. The second open section was longer, maybe 50 meters of open riverbank between the brush line and the water's edge, and then the river itself, and then whatever thin cover existed on the far bank. She came out of the brush at full speed and didn't slow down, didn't look at the ridge, didn't check for the muzzle flash that might precede the round that ended everything. Just ran, pack jolting against her spine, counting her steps automatically, focusing on the water's edge. A round hit the rocks to her left, then another, further behind her. She hit the water without slowing. It was shockingly cold, mountain runoff, knee-deep at the bank and waist-deep within 4 steps. The current pulling hard at her legs and making every step a negotiation. She kept moving. The bottom was uneven and she stumbled once, went down to one hand, came back up soaking and off balance, and kept moving. The far bank came up and she grabbed a root and pulled herself out. She lay on the bank for 5 seconds, just breathing. Then she got up and started moving toward the perimeter. Halt. Ethan met her at the tree line edge. He didn't say anything when he saw her. Soaking wet, pack still on, knee bleeding from where she'd gone down in the river, breathing hard. She looked at him with the expression she'd been using since they were children, the one that said, "I'm fine, don't make this a thing." He didn't make it a thing. "Critical first," she said, and he turned and led her into the perimeter. What she found when she got there was controlled triage chaos, the specific organized disaster of a medical situation that has been managed by competent people under impossible conditions. Corpsman Daly had done everything he could with what he had, which was substantial, but the gap between what battlefield medicine could provide and what these patients needed was visible and widening. She went to Cobb first, the abdominal wound. She took one look, ran her assessment in approximately 45 seconds, pulse, respiration, abdomen tension, the color of his skin, and pulled her surgical pack. Daly. She didn't look up. Talk me through his timeline. GSW approximately 93 minutes ago, Daly said, moving to assist without being asked. Entry right lower quadrant, no exit. I've got 2 large bore IVs running. He's had 1 liter of saline. BP was 65/40 when I last checked, maybe 10 minutes ago. Check it again, Daly checked. 70/palp. Trending up. Okay. She was already working, her hands moving through the familiar sequence of an advanced field assessment, while the rest of her attention tracked the firefight sounds around her and cataloged the other patients she could see. Who else is in immediate danger? 2 with tension pneumo. I've decompressed both, but one of them I'm not confident the needle is still seated. Marine in the far right corner has a tourniquet on the left leg. Might be too distal. I haven't had a chance to recheck. And there's a guy near the airway compromise? Not yet, but the one in the corner. Show me. She left Cobb, stabilized for the moment, as stable as he was going to get in the next few minutes, and let Daly lead her to the airway risk. She found a Marine sitting propped against a tree, a corpsman beside him, his breathing audible from 4 feet away. Stridor. The kind that meant the upper airway was working against itself. She knelt in front of him. He was conscious, scared, which was appropriate, but conscious and looking at her with the alertness of someone who understood that their situation was serious. Hey, she kept her voice level. I'm Emma. I'm a Navy medic. I need to look at your throat, okay? Don't try to talk. He nodded. She assessed quickly. Blast injury, soft tissue swelling around the neck, trachea midline, but the airway was narrowing as the swelling progressed. Not there yet. Getting there. I'm going to give you a shot, she said. It'll help reduce the swelling. If it doesn't help enough, I'm going to have to put a tube in your throat, and I need you to stay very still when I do that. Can you do that? He nodded again. She drew the medication, administered it, and gave it 90 seconds to begin working while she moved to the tourniquet patient, assessed the placement, and adjusted it. Slightly proximal, better position, the Marine making a sound through his teeth as she tightened it that told her the nerve endings in his legs still worked, which was a good sign. When she came back, the airway patient's stridor had reduced. Slightly. Enough. She kept him under observation and moved to the next patient and the next, working through the critical list with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows that efficiency is itself a form of care. Daly worked beside her, anticipating and supplying, asking questions when he had them and staying quiet when he didn't. He was good, better than good. He was exhausted and still good, which was harder. You did well, she told him quietly during a brief moment between patients. All of this. You did well. He didn't answer. He just moved to the next supply item she'd need before she asked for it. The firefight had a different texture now. Not quieter exactly, but more intermittent. The sustained exchanges had given way to a pattern of probing and response that suggested both sides were managing ammunition carefully. Ethan was directing it from a position 30 meters from Emma's triage area, moving between the perimeter and the command position with the controlled urgency of someone who had been making rapid decisions for over 90 minutes and had not yet found a moment to stop. He came to check on Emma once, around 0847. Stood beside her for 30 seconds without speaking, watching her work on a patient, and then left without a word. She didn't acknowledge him. Neither of them needed the acknowledgement. What they both needed, and neither yet had, was extraction. Air support had been promised 3 times in the last 90 minutes. 3 times the timeline had slipped. Technical difficulties, weather at the departure airfield, airspace coordination issues, the specific vague language that command used when things weren't going well, and they didn't want to say so directly. Marsh was becoming increasingly frustrated with the communications, which he expressed by speaking more slowly and precisely on the radio as his frustration increased. A habit Ethan had noticed early in their time together and had come to read as a reliable indicator of how bad things actually were. At 0851, Marsh's voice went very slow and very precise. Ethan walked over. What? Marsh held up one finger. Wait, and listened for another 10 seconds. Then he lowered the handset and looked at his commander with the expression of a man delivering news he would rather not deliver. The primary CAS package has been redirected, Marsh said. Higher priority engagement at grid Delta 7. Delta 7 is 40 kilometers from here. Yes, sir. What's the secondary package? Spun up at the forward airfield. ETA is... Marsh paused. 60 to 90 minutes. Ethan stood still. 60 to 90 minutes. He looked at his remaining ammunition report, at the wounded count, at the perimeter, thinning, people running on empty, the discipline holding but the physical reserves diminishing. He looked at the tree line where the enemy had been steady for over 2 hours. 60 to 90 minutes, he repeated. Yes, sir. He turned and looked at Emma, 30 meters away, kneeling over a patient, working with the same focused intensity she'd been working with since she arrived. She didn't know yet. She was working with the assumption that extraction was imminent. He was going to have to tell her. And he was going to have to tell his people, somehow, that what he needed from them was 60 more minutes of the thing they were almost out of. Not ammunition, not medical supplies, not water. Will. That was all they had left in quantity. And Will, in Ethan's experience, was the least reliable resource and the only one that couldn't be resupplied from outside. He started walking back toward the perimeter. Halfway there, Okafor fell in beside him. Heard the timeline, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. How are we doing on 556? Not great. She was quiet for a few steps. You know what's funny? I joined this branch because I thought infantry was going to be straightforward. Clear mission, clear enemy, clear goal. Is it not? She gave him a look that, under different circumstances, might have been accompanied by a short laugh. Commander, we are standing in the middle of a flanked, encircled, ammunition-depleted position in a valley that someone spent weeks preparing to kill us in, waiting for air support that keeps not showing up, while your sister patches people together with supplies she hand-carried through a mountain range by herself. She paused. It's not very straightforward. No, he agreed. It's not. They reached the forward edge of the perimeter. The tree line was 40 meters south. An enemy position, one that had been quiet for the last 12 minutes, which was itself a kind of message, sat somewhere in the shadows beyond the first rank of trees. 12 minutes of quiet was too long. Ethan looked at the tree line and felt something shift in his gut, the specific instinctual warning system that combat experience builds slowly and communicates bluntly. Okafor, I see it. She'd felt it too. The tree line was about to stop being quiet, and 60 minutes was going to feel like a very long time. The tree line moved. Not the wind. There was no wind. This was the specific, deliberate movement of bodies repositioning inside cover, the kind that Ethan had learned to distinguish from everything else that moves in a landscape because the cost of confusing them was too high. All elements, stand by, he said into his radio. Quiet, level. Okafor was already signaling her squad. Reeve had his machine gun team shifting angle without being told. Down the line, Marines who had been conserving energy in the brief lull came back to alert positions with the slow, practiced motion of people who understand that moving fast draws attention, and moving right matters more than moving fast. The tree line stopped moving, 30 seconds of silence, then it opened up. The assault was different from what they'd been dealing with all morning. What came out of the trees wasn't a probing exchange. It was a coordinated push, multiple positions firing simultaneously in a sustained pattern designed to suppress the entire perimeter, while a maneuver element moved. Ethan saw the maneuver element almost immediately. Two groups, 6 to 8 fighters each, pushing along the eastern and western flanks of the open ground in short rushes, using the sustained fire from the tree line as cover. Classic bounding overwatch, textbook, executed by people who'd done it before. Left flank! Okafor's voice, sharp and immediate. They're in the open, 40 meters, eastern approach, machine gun, now. Reeves' gun opened up. The eastern maneuver group went to ground, and one of them didn't get back up, but the rest dispersed into whatever cover the terrain offered and kept moving. Slower now, but moving. Ethan was calculating. The perimeter they'd established was roughly circular, maybe 60 meters in diameter, centered on the triage position where Emma was working. It had been adequate for a static defense against the probing fire they'd been absorbing. It was not adequate for a simultaneous two-axis assault by disciplined fighters with the ammunition and manpower to sustain it. They had maybe 3 minutes before the flanking elements reached close engagement range. At that point, the perimeter would become hand-to-hand, and with the ammunition state they were carrying, the outcome of that was not a question Ethan was willing to let become answered. Reeves, he called. The lieutenant appeared from his left. Here. Take 8 people and collapse the eastern side inward, 30 meters. I need a tighter perimeter. We can't hold this diameter. We pull back, we give them the ground they need to establish inside 50 meters. We don't pull back. The flanking element gets into our wire and it's over. 30 meters. Move the wounded first. Reeves understood the logic, even if he didn't like it. He moved. What followed was the specific controlled ugliness of a tactical withdrawal under fire. The hardest maneuver in infantry because it requires everyone to move in the same direction at the same time while still maintaining fire. Which means the people who move last are exposed longest. Which means someone always gets the worst of it. In this case, it was a young Marine named Figueroa, who was in the rearmost position when the eastern flankers got close enough to engage accurately, and who took a round through the upper arm that spun him and put him down before he could make the new line. 2 Marines went back for him without being ordered. They got him out. He was screaming, and then he wasn't screaming, and the silence where the screaming had been was somehow worse, until Ethan saw that Emma had reached him. She'd been watching the withdrawal from her triage position and had moved the moment she identified the new casualty, moving toward the fire instead of away from it, which was a thing he had watched her do before in training scenarios, and had always made him feel a specific complicated mixture of pride and dread. She got to Figueroa and went to work. The rounds were still coming. Ethan stopped watching and focused on his perimeter. The collapse to the tighter position took 4 minutes and cost them 2 more men wounded and 1 killed. A corpsman named Torres, who had been in continuous motion for nearly 2 hours, treating patient after patient, and who took a single round while moving a wounded Marine to the new perimeter line. Torres went down and didn't get up. His patient, the Marine he'd been moving, survived. Ethan didn't have time to absorb this. He filed it and kept moving. The tighter perimeter was more defensible in the sense that it required fewer people to cover the same number of angles. It was also smaller, which meant the wounded were closer to the fighting, which meant the noise and the proximity of the exchange were adding to the stress on people whose systems were already overwhelmed. He could see it in the patients Emma was managing, elevated heart rates in the ones who were conscious, the particular involuntary flinching that bodies do when sounds register as threat, even in people who are too injured to respond to threat. Emma saw it too. He watched her briefly, speaking to a conscious patient. Low voice, direct eye contact, one hand on the man's shoulder while her other hand checked his IV site, keeping the human connection going in the middle of everything because she understood that panic consumed oxygen and oxygen was in finite supply. Walker. Marsh was at his elbow. I've got command on the line. They want a sit rep. Tell them we've collapsed the perimeter under assault. We have 31 wounded, 20 confirmed KIA, and we are in active contact with a coordinated enemy force executing a flanking assault. Tell them if the secondary CAS package is not here in 30 minutes, they need to upgrade this to a mass casualty event and start planning accordingly. Marsh was quiet for a half second. They're not going to like that framing. I'm not interested in what they like. Send it. He moved to the western side of the perimeter. The second flanking element had gone to ground after taking fire from Reeves' team, but they hadn't withdrawn. They were out there, somewhere in the uneven terrain on the western approach, waiting for the eastern element to get close enough to create a split attention problem. He found Reeve himself at the western machine gun position, lying behind a rock berm that he'd partially constructed from loose stones in the last 20 minutes, his gun covering a shallow ravine that the western element would have to cross if they pushed. How long before they move? Ethan asked. Reeve didn't take his eye off the ravine. They're waiting for the eastern side to draw our attention. Standard doctrinal flanking. They want us looking right before they push left. Can you see them? Not clearly. I can see where they're not moving, which tells me where they are. He paused. There's a cluster of rocks at the ravine's far edge, about 70 meters. They're behind it. 70 meters with a machine gun was comfortable range. Why haven't you engaged? Because if I open up from here, I reveal my position, and they go to ground and wait me out. Right now, they don't know exactly where my gun is. That's worth more than a few rounds at a target I can't confirm. He finally looked at Ethan. You want me to change that calculus, sir? I will. But I'd rather wait until they're in the ravine where I can do real damage. Ethan looked at the ravine. Reeve was right, and the fact that Reeve was right created a problem. Waiting meant letting the eastern side get close enough to create the split attention problem the western element was waiting for. Not waiting meant burning the western gun's concealment for uncertain results. He was holding a bad hand in deciding which card to play first. Hold, he said, but be ready to go loud the second they move. He left Reeve watching his ravine and walked back to the center of the perimeter, where Marsh was finishing the sitrep transmission with the particular tone that had moved beyond slow and precise into something approaching icy. What did they say? The secondary package is wheels up, ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes. From 60 to 90, now 45. Either the timeline had improved or command was managing him. Which airfield? Marsh checked his notes. Keller forward. Ethan did the math. Keller forward was the right distance for a 45-minute ETA if they were flying fast and direct. It was possible. Not certain, but possible. What's the weather at Keller? Marsh checked again. Paused. They didn't specify. Of course they didn't. But the eastern flanking element made its move at 0912. They'd gotten to within 30 meters during the sustained fire exchange, using the trees and rocks for concealment, moving in increments too small to track individually. When they pushed all at once. 6 fighters coming out of cover simultaneously, closing distance fast, and the eastern perimeter opened up on them immediately. But at 30 meters, the exchange had a different quality than it had at 60. 2 of the 6 went down in the first seconds. The other 4 reached the outer edge of the perimeter. What happened next was the part that Ethan would replay many times in the months afterward, not because it was the worst part of the day, but because it was the moment when the day stopped being a tactical problem and became something else. He was moving towards the eastern contact when he heard Emma's voice. Not her medical voice, not the calm, controlled tone she used with patients. Her actual voice, sharp and immediate, cutting through the firefight noise. "Gun! He's got a—" Then the sound of a weapon discharging at very close range, then silence from Emma's direction for approximately 1 second, which was the longest second Ethan Walker had experienced in 11 years of military service. He was running before the second ended. What he found when he reached the triage area was not what he'd feared, and it was also not good. One of the 4 fighters who'd broken the eastern perimeter had gotten into the triage area before being engaged. He'd made it approximately 10 meters in before Corpsman Daly had tackled him. Daly, who had no weapon, because corpsmen were treating patients and carrying medical gear and had been doing nothing but medicine for 2 hours. Daly had tackled him with the particular graceless desperation of someone whose instincts had moved faster than his training, and they were on the ground together when Ethan arrived, the weapon between them, Daly's forearm across the fighter's throat. Emma was 6 feet away, kneeling on the fighter's gun arm, her weight keeping it pinned while her free hand applied pressure to a gash on her own forearm that was bleeding steadily through her fingers. The fighter was not going to be a problem. Okafor was behind him. Ethan took in the scene in 2 seconds. Then he looked at Emma. How bad? She looked at her arm with clinical detachment. Superficial. Blade. I've had worse. When have you had worse? Fallujah. 2019. She stood up, transferring the pressure to her other hand. I need a wrap so I can use both hands. Can someone— I've got it. Daly was already up, already pulling gauze from his kit despite the fact that he was the one who'd just been in a fight with an armed man and probably deserved 30 seconds to catch his breath. He wrapped Emma's forearm quickly and competently. Ethan looked at the patients. 2 of them had been moved during the breach, physically moved, shifted to different positions. He looked at Emma questioningly. I moved them when I saw them coming, she said. Away from the approach angle. She said it simply, without emphasis, the way she described things that seemed obvious to her. The critical ones couldn't move themselves, so I moved them. She had seen the breach coming, repositioned 4 patients, 4 while keeping her hands on a 5th, and then physically intervened when the fighter reached the triage area. She had done this with 42 pounds of pack, a knee that had been showing her its displeasure for hours, and less than 90 minutes of sleep in the previous 24 hours. Ethan looked at her for a moment. She was already back at work. He went back to his perimeter. What? The eastern breach was closed. 2 of the 4 who'd gotten through were dead. 1 was restrained. 1 had withdrawn when Okafor's squad counterattacked the breach. The sustained fire from the tree line had dropped off. They were managing ammunition too, and the assault had cost them people. But the western element was still out there. Reeves Ravine was still uncrossed. And the math was getting worse. Ethan gathered what he had. Approximately 180 Marines still able to fight, though fight was a generous word for people this depleted, this low on ammunition, this many hours into sustained contact. 20 rounds per rifle was the average. Some had more, some had less. Reeves' machine gun had 1 belt remaining plus a partial. The mortars they'd been taking had been silent for 20 minutes, which might mean the crews were repositioning or might mean something had happened to them. Impossible to tell. He convened what passed for a command consultation. Okafor, Reeves, Reeve, and his most experienced squad leaders, in a tight cluster near the center of the perimeter, speaking quietly enough that their voices didn't carry. Assessment, he said. Okafor went first. Eastern element is reduced, maybe half of what they started with. They're not going to push again soon. A pause. The western element is different. They've been patient. Patient usually means confident. Reeves, we're not going to hold this perimeter for 45 minutes on what we're carrying. Nobody argued with that. Options, Ethan said. Silence for 3 seconds, long enough to feel. We can try to push south again. Reeves didn't sound like he believed it. Through whatever's left of the tree line. With 20 rounds a rifle. Right. The river, Okafor said. North. Back the way we came. The northern ridge is still active. Intermittently. That's still active. Another silence. Reeve, who'd been quiet, spoke. There's a third option. He said it with the reluctance of someone raising an idea they know sounds bad because the available options are all bad. We consolidate the ammunition we have. Every round gets pooled and redistributed to the people most likely to use it effectively, and then we stop engaging at range and wait for them to come to us. Let them set the engagement terms. At 20 rounds a rifle, we're not setting anything. We're just burning through it faster by shooting at targets we can't confirm. He looked at Ethan directly. If we pool and wait, we can respond to an actual assault with concentrated fire instead of distributing our deficit across every probing exchange. It was the most defensively passive option available. It was also, Ethan recognized, probably correct given what they had. Do it, he said. Okafor, coordinate the redistribution. Reeve, keep your gun in reserve until we have a confirmed target worth the belt. He looked at Reeves. What's our status on extraction LZ? The clearing on the eastern edge is big enough for 2 aircraft simultaneously. Ground is workable. Reeves paused. It's also partially within range of the northern ridge. We'll work with it. He looked at each of them. 45 minutes. That's what we're holding for. Not winning, not pushing, holding. They moved to execute. Emma discovered the problem with Corporal Ray Cobb at 0924. She'd been managing him as the most critical patient, checking every 15 minutes, adjusting his IVs, monitoring the indicators she could monitor in the field. He had been trending, not well, but stable enough that she'd been able to prioritize the acute presentations and come back to him. When she came back at 0924, his pressure had dropped. Not gradually. Dropped. 52 over palp, down from the 70s she'd been holding him at. His respiratory rate had increased. His color was wrong. She ran a rapid reassessment and found it in 40 seconds. Internal bleeding, progressing, the kind that field medicine could slow but not stop. The abdominal injury was worse than the initial presentation had suggested, or it had progressed while she'd been managing everything else, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at what she had. 2 units of blood remaining. IV access, good. Medications limited. No surgical capability. No way to stop the bleeding that mattered. Daly was beside her. He'd read her face before she said anything. How long? He asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at Cobb, conscious still, watching her with the specific alert and afraid expression of someone who knows the people around them are concerned and is trying to read their faces for information the people aren't providing verbally. Hey! She moved her face into his eye line, blocking his view of Daly. I'm going to give you the blood now, okay? It's going to help stabilize you. Is it bad? Cobb's voice was thin, dry. It's serious. You already knew that. She held eye contact. I'm not going to lie to you about what's happening. What I can tell you is that you're still here and the evacuation is coming and I am not done with you. He looked at her for a long moment. My sister's in Atlanta. Tell me about her. She's... He stopped, swallowed. She's annoying as hell. She calls me every Sunday at 7 a.m. because she knows I hate mornings. She sounds great. She's the worst. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She's really great. Emma started the blood transfusion. You're going to call her. When you get home, you're going to call her on a Sunday at 7 a.m. and you're going to pretend you called her first. He looked at her. You think I'm going to make it? She held his gaze. I think you are not dying on my watch. That's what I think. She turned back to her supplies, back to Daly, and said quietly enough that Cobb couldn't hear. He needs to be on the first aircraft out. First, not second. First. Daly nodded. She went back to work. The western element crossed the ravine at 0937. Reeve had been watching it for 90 minutes. He'd tracked every rock, every shadow, every incremental shift of position in the terrain beyond the ravine's far edge. When they moved, he was ready. Not because he'd seen it coming with certainty, but because he'd been ready continuously, and readiness that's maintained long enough eventually catches its moment. He opened up when the lead element was 12 meters into the ravine. The last belt fed through with the specific sound that machine guns make when they're doing exactly what they were designed to do, and in the confined, channelized space of the ravine, the effect was decisive. The lead element went down. The trailing element went to ground. 3 fighters reached the near side of the ravine and took cover in the rocks. 3 inside the wire. But the main body, 6 to 8, Reeve had counted, was pinned in the ravine or had pulled back. "Guns empty!" Reeve's voice, no longer caring about the noise. He transitioned to his rifle. The 3 fighters who'd made it across were maneuvering. Ethan saw them from his position and moved to intercept. And what followed was the kind of close-range engagement that doesn't translate well to reports or briefings. Confusing, fast, resolved by instinct and proximity more than plan. He was part of it, and afterward couldn't have reconstructed the exact sequence of events with confidence. What he could tell was that when it was over, the Western incursion was contained. At cost. Always at cost. Reeves caught a round across the outside of his thigh. A graze that bled badly and hurt worse, but didn't stop him from continuing to function. He wrapped it himself while his squad leader held his position, and then went back to moving as if the wrap was simply a thing he'd needed to do, and now it was done. Ethan had a cut across his left forearm from a rock fragment that he didn't notice until Marsh pointed at it approximately 4 minutes after the fact. The perimeter held. At 09:52, Marsh came to find him with the radio handset already extended. Ethan took it. The voice on the other end wasn't command. It wasn't the standard transmission cadence of the network they'd been operating on all morning. It was a different frequency, the one Emma had been using for her satellite radio. And the voice wasn't Emma. It was a man's voice, speaking clearly, without the ambient noise of the firefight, with the measured cadence of someone who wanted to be heard precisely and completely. "Commander Walker, this is not a transmission you should ignore. I have information about why your unit was sent into this valley. I have information about who sent you there and why you were not given accurate intelligence. This information affects people in your chain of command." Ethan stared at the handset. "I understand you have no reason to trust this communication. I also understand you are currently occupied. But when you have a moment, and I believe you will have a moment soon, I would like to speak with you. The aircraft that are coming are real. But the orders that put you in this valley were not clean. You should know that before the rescue narrative gets written without you." The transmission ended. Ethan stood with the handset. Marsh was watching him. "Sir, what was that?" Ethan looked at the handset, then at the perimeter, then at the cleared space where the triage area was, where Emma was still working, where Ray Cobb was still alive because Emma had decided he was going to be. "Log it," he said. "Time, frequency, exact content. All of it." "And then?" He handed the handset back. "And then we hold for 33 more minutes." The next 30 minutes were not the worst of the day. The worst had already happened in increments. In the valley, at the river, in the moments where the math of surviving had required costs that couldn't be argued with. What the next 30 minutes were was relentless. A sustained, grinding pressure that tested the perimeter not through assault, but through continuous engagement, probing fire, shifts in angle, the occasional mortar round from the northern ridge that had come back online, the western element reorganizing outside the ravine and pushing at irregular intervals. Nothing definitive. Nothing that broke through. Just the steady application of pressure on people who were running on reserves they'd already spent. Emma ran out of blood at 09:59. She used the last unit on a Marine named Specialist Torres, not Corseman Torres, who was dead, a different Torres, Specialist David Torres from New Mexico, whose bleeding she'd been managing for 40 minutes, and who had reached the point where she needed to decide between him and the remaining inventory. She used it on Torres. She made the decision the way she made all of them, rapidly, without visible anguish, based on clinical assessment rather than emotion. And then she moved to the next patient without looking back, because looking back didn't help Torres, and it didn't help the next patient. After the blood was gone, she kept working with what she had: pressure, positioning, airway management, the interventions that didn't require supplies so much as knowledge and attention, and the willingness to stay present in a situation that had been demanding presence for 3 hours. Daly worked beside her. He was beyond exhausted in a way that his body had started advertising. A fine tremor in his hands that appeared between precise movements and disappeared when precision was required. the specific paradox of adrenaline and fatigue operating simultaneously. He said almost nothing. He handed her things before she asked for them. He was extraordinary in the way that goes unrecognized because it expresses itself as competence rather than drama. At 10:13, Marsh appeared at the edge of the triage area. He looked at Ethan, who had moved to the triage perimeter to manage the ammunition redistribution updates from a central location. 10 minutes, Marsh said. Emma looked up from her patient. CAS and extraction package, Ethan said. 10 minutes out. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she looked at her patients, at the triage area that she had managed and organized and fought to protect for the last 100+ minutes, at the people she'd kept alive through blood and pressure and stubbornness, and the simple refusal to accept what the situation was trying to tell her was inevitable. I need the first aircraft for Cobb and Torres, she said. Both of them, together. Understood. Ethan. She rarely used his name in the field. When she did, he paid attention. Cobb's window is closing. First aircraft, not second. First aircraft, he confirmed. She went back to work. Boss. The aircraft came in from the northeast, below the ridgeline, flying fast and low in the specific way that helicopter pilots fly when they understand that the ground is actively trying to kill them and altitude is an enemy. 2 aircraft initially, then a third, then sounds from higher altitude that resolved into the distinct signature of close air support, a different kind of aircraft entirely, one whose presence meant the ridge positions were about to have a conversation they hadn't initiated. The close air support went to work on the northern ridge first. Ethan watched the impacts from the perimeter edge, precise, deliberate, the kind of fire delivery that comes from a targeting package rather than guesswork. And the ridge position went silent mid-burst, which was the specific silence that meant the crew was no longer a problem. The helicopters hit the clearing on the eastern edge. It wasn't clean. It was never going to be clean. The LZ took fire from the remnants of the western element even as the aircraft were landing, and 2 of them aborted the first attempt and came around again while suppressive fire from the CAS aircraft covered the approach. The first helicopter that landed successfully took 3 rounds through its tail section and would not fly again under its own power, but it was on the ground and the crew was out and the loading began. Cobb went first. Emma supervised his loading personally, directing the stretcher bearers, positioning him correctly, running one final assessment with her hands before she stepped back and let the crew take him. She said something to him as he was loaded. She said it quietly, close to his ear, and he looked at her and then looked away and she stepped back. Torres went on the same aircraft, second position. The loading continued. Critical patients first, then urgent, then walking wounded, then those who could fight. The extraction had its own logic and its own chaos, aircraft coming and going, rotor wash making communication difficult, incoming fire from 2 directions requiring suppressive response from Marines who were diverting from loading to firing and back, the specific dangerous multitasking of a hot LZ extraction that no training simulation ever fully approximates. Ethan moved through it, directed, organized, made decisions faster than he could think them through, which was the only pace available. Okafor was the last squad leader to load. She looked at him before she stepped onto the aircraft with the expression she'd been using all day, the one that understood the situation completely and had no better alternatives to offer. Good call, she said, on Reeve holding the ravine. Good call. He didn't answer. She loaded. He turned and found Emma at his shoulder. She was soaking again from some combination of river water and 3 hours of physical effort in mountain terrain. Her forearm wrap was blood-saturated. Her knee, which she'd stopped mentioning, was clearly worse than she'd been representing. She was favoring her left leg in a way that she probably didn't realize was visible. You need to get on an aircraft, he said. So do you. I'm the last one out. I'm aware. She didn't move toward the aircraft. Emma? When you go, I go. She said it simply, the same way she'd said things since they were children. Decisions presented as facts, completed before they were announced. So let's go. The last aircraft was holding on the LZ, rotor at full power, taking sporadic fire from the reorganized western element that was being worked on by the CAS package overhead. The crew chief was watching them from the door with an expression that communicated, across the distance and the noise, The specific urgency of a man who understood that the aircraft was a target as long as it was on the ground. Ethan looked at the perimeter. Empty. Checked. Clear. He looked at the valley beyond, at the smoke and the silence and the terrain that had spent the last 4 hours trying to answer a question about whether 280 Marines could be erased without witness or consequence. He looked at his sister. Then he walked to the aircraft, and she walked beside him, and the crew chief pulled them aboard before they'd fully cleared the door, and the aircraft was climbing before Ethan found a handhold, the ground dropping away below them with the particular vertiginous relief of surviving something that had no reason to have been survived. The valley shrank. The ridgeline shrank. The river that had taken men and given nothing back became a thread of silver in the landscape below, indifferent to everything that had happened along its banks. Ethan looked out the open door and thought about the voice on the satellite radio. The measured cadence, the specific words. The orders that put you in this valley were not clean. He looked at Marsh, who was across from him in the aircraft, radio on his lap, looking back at him with the expression of a man who had logged every word of a transmission and had been thinking about it ever since. The aircraft banked east. Below them, the valley held its silence. The aircraft landed at Keller Forward at 10:47. The rotors were still decelerating when the medical teams came out to meet them. 3 teams, gurneys, equipment bags, the organized urgency of people who had been briefed on what was coming and had prepared accordingly. Ethan watched through the open door as they reached the aircraft, before the skids had fully settled, hands already reaching for the first stretcher. Cobb came off first. Emma had positioned him that way, and she stayed with him through the transfer, walking alongside the gurney at a pace that was technically a jog, speaking to the receiving medic in the clipped shorthand of clinical handoff. BP trending, blood transfused, 2 units O negative, abdominal GSW, 94 minutes old, internal bleeding suspected progressive. The receiving medic was nodding before she finished, already relaying to the trauma team ahead of them. Ethan stepped off the aircraft and his legs took his weight, and he stood on solid ground for the first time in 4.5 hours, and the sensation was strange in a way he didn't have words for. Marsh was beside him, still carrying the radio, still had the handset. Logs secured, Marsh said. He meant the transmission, the voice, the satellite frequency. He'd been carrying it like a physical weight since they'd lifted off, and Ethan could see in his face that he'd been thinking about what to do with it during the entire flight. Good. Ethan looked at the forward operating base around them, the controlled activity of a facility that knew something serious had happened and was responding to it. Vehicles moving, personnel at purpose, the particular energy of a place that had received bad news and was processing it through action. Who's the senior officer on site? Colonel Hargrove. He was waiting on the tarmac when we radioed ahead. Ethan looked around and found him immediately. A tall man in his 50s standing 30 meters back from the medical activity, with the deliberate posture of someone who had chosen to give the medical team's room and was now waiting for the room to become his. Colonel David Hargrove, whom Ethan had met twice in formal contexts and once in a hallway at a briefing, and whose reputation was the specific kind that accumulated in layers, competent on the surface, difficult to read underneath. Hargrove started walking toward him. Ethan stood his ground and waited. What? Commander Walker! Hargrove stopped 3 feet away. His eyes went briefly to Ethan's arm, the rock fragment cut, now dried, which Ethan had forgotten about, and then back to his face. I'm glad you're out. Thank you, sir. I want a full debrief as soon as you've been seen by medical. I'd like to do it now. Hargrove studied him for a moment. You've been in sustained contact for almost 5 hours. Yes, sir. That's why I'd like to do it now, while my memory is current. He held the colonel's gaze. And I'd like Corporal Marsh present. He was on comms throughout. Something moved behind Hargrove's eyes. Not quite a reaction, more the suppression of one. Of course. Conference room in Building 4, 30 minutes. He walked away. Ethan watched him go. Sir, Marsh's voice quiet. He didn't ask about casualties. Ethan had noticed. No, he didn't. Mustn't. Medical took 12 minutes. A physician's assistant named Rourke, who had clearly been doing this long enough to move fast and ask questions, simultaneously ran through Ethan with the efficiency of someone who understood that the patient in front of him was not going to be a cooperative subject for rest and recovery. The arm is superficial, you know that, Rourke said, cleaning the cut with the brisk manner of someone for whom this was the least interesting injury he'd seen today. Anything else? Headache, vision disturbance, ringing in the ears? Blast exposure. Mortar, approximately 12 meters, around 0630. Rourke looked at him. And you've been commanding a unit in sustained contact for the last 4.5 hours since that blast exposure. Yes. Any confusion? Memory gaps? No. That you're aware of. That I'm aware of. Rourke made a note. I'm going to recommend 24 hours of observation. You're going to decline. I'm going to decline. I'll note that too. He finished with the arm and stepped back. Your sister's in surgical holding with one of your critical cases. She's been in there for... He checked his watch. 20 minutes. She went straight from the tarmac. Ethan absorbed this. The abdominal case, Cobb. That's the one. Rourke paused. She briefed the surgical team herself on the flight in. Full clinical history. Intervention timeline. Her assessment of the progression. The trauma surgeon told me it was the most thorough field handoff she'd received in her career. He said it neutrally, which was its own kind of emphasis. Ethan looked at the door. She's going to be in there a while. Probably. He left for Building 4. The conference room had a table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, and Colonel Hargrove already seated at the head with a junior aide and a woman Ethan didn't recognize sitting to his right. The woman was in civilian clothes, mid-40s, dark hair cut short, the kind of stillness that people develop when they're paid to observe things. Ethan came in, Marsh behind him. Ethan sat at the far end of the table from Hargrove. He didn't sit to the colonel's left or right, where the spatial arrangement would have framed him as subordinate to the center of the table. He sat at the opposite end, which framed the table as a negotiating space, which was accurate. Hargrove noticed. He didn't say anything about it. This is Ms. Vance, Hargrove said, indicating the woman. She's with the Defense Intelligence Agency, currently attached to this theater. Vance nodded at Ethan without offering anything additional. I'd like to understand who she is in relation to the debrief before we start, Ethan said. Hargrove's aide opened his mouth. Hargrove closed it with a look. Ms. Vance has a relevant interest in the events of this morning. She'll be observing. Relevant how? Hargrove met his gaze. Commander, you've had an extremely difficult morning. I want to get your account on record before... Sir. Ethan put his hands flat on the table. I received a transmission this morning on a compromised satellite frequency. The transmission contained claims about the intelligence package that put us in that valley. I'd like to understand who's in this room before I discuss that transmission. He looked at Vance directly. So I'll ask again. Relevant how? Vance looked at Hargrove. Whatever passed between them was brief and decided. Ms. Vance was part of the team that generated the intelligence assessment for your patrol route, Hargrove said. The room was quiet for a moment. The intelligence assessment, Ethan said, that described Blackwater Valley as low threat, recommended it as the primary patrol axis, and provided a map of the river crossing that did not reflect current conditions. He kept his voice level. That assessment. Intelligence is imperfect by nature, Commander. You know that. I do. He pulled his copy of the patrol order from his jacket pocket, the laminated card he'd been carrying all morning, now water-stained and worn at the fold lines. He laid it on the table. The SIGINT sweep cited in this order was 72 hours old. The river crossing data was 14 days old. The ridge assessment hadn't been updated in 3 weeks. He looked at Hargrove. In an area where enemy activity had been reported in the 5 days prior to our insertion. Hargrove's expression was controlled. The reporting you're referencing was assessed as unverified. By whom? A pause. By the assessment team. By Ms. Vance's team. Vance spoke for the first time. Her voice was even, precise, the kind of voice that has learned to stay measured because the alternative is not professionally useful. Commander Walker, the reporting in question came from a single source of limited reliability. Standard protocol is to weight it accordingly until it can be corroborated. That source reported fighters on the northern ridge of Blackwater Valley 5 days before my unit walked into that valley. Ethan looked at her. The fighters were there. They'd been there for 11 days based on the position construction we observed. Someone had that information, and someone decided it didn't meet the bar for adjusting our patrol route. Vance held his gaze. I understand your frustration. I have 23 dead Marines, Ethan said. The number had been updated on the flight in. 4 more in the critical category had not survived the extraction, including one who had died in the aircraft before they landed. I have 31 wounded. I am not frustrated, Ms. Vance. I am asking a specific question about a specific decision, and I would like a specific answer. The room held the silence. Hargrove set his pen down on the notepad in front of him, carefully. Commander, tell me about the satellite transmission. He told them, all of it, the frequency, the timing, the exact words as he remembered them. Marsh's logged record, which Marsh produced and laid on the table without being asked. Hargrove and Vance listened without interrupting. The aide took notes. Vance's expression, which had been controlled throughout, became more controlled as Ethan reached the specific content of the transmission. The orders that put you in this valley were not clean, which was itself a kind of data. When he finished, Hargrove was quiet for several seconds. The frequency that transmission came through, Hargrove said finally, that's a restricted channel. Yes, sir. Not accessible to civilian communications. No, sir. Which means whoever sent it had military access or had taken it from someone who did. Ethan nodded. Yes. Vance leaned forward slightly. Commander, do you have any idea who that transmission came from? No. He watched her face. Do you? Her expression didn't change. That was in itself an answer of a kind. Hargrove picked his pen back up, turned it in his fingers. This transmission, and the claims it made, cannot be treated as verified intelligence. You understand that? I understand that it's unverified. I also understand that it was transmitted on a restricted military channel to a personal satellite radio during an active engagement, which suggests that whoever sent it had access to real-time information about our tactical situation, or had planned in advance when to send it. That's possible. It's also concerning in a different way. Hargrove set the pen down again. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man doing 2 things simultaneously, the visible thing and another thing beneath it. I want to be direct with you, Commander. You've been through something significant today. Your account of the engagement is going to be important for the investigation, but the claims in that transmission are going to be investigated. A pause. Yes. By whom? By the appropriate... Sir? Ethan leaned forward. 23 of my people are dead. The valley we were sent into had been prepared for weeks. Someone with access to our patrol route and timeline knew we were coming. And now someone with access to restricted military communications is telling me the orders weren't clean. He stopped. Let that sit. I need to know that the investigation is being conducted by people who don't have a stake in its outcome. Hargrove looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Vance. Vance looked at the table. I'll make some calls, Hargrove said. It wasn't a promise. It was the shape of a promise with the substance still to be determined. Ethan recognized the distinction and said nothing about it. One more thing, Ethan said. He reached into his jacket and produced a second piece of paper. The notes he'd written on the aircraft, in the turbulent air, with his blood-dried hand about every specific detail of the tactical situation in the valley that had struck him as inconsistent with an opportunistic ambush. The prepositioned mortars, the synchronized firing positions, the river crossing that had been altered. He was almost certain now that the flooding wasn't entirely natural. The way the enemy element had known the patrol timeline with enough precision to have 3-sided coverage ready. I want this on record, formally, with my signature and Corporal Marsh's. He laid it on the table. Hargrove looked at it but didn't pick it up immediately. That's your right, Hargrove said. I know it is. The debrief ended at 12:04. Ethan had been awake for 22 hours. He didn't sleep. He went to the hospital building and found the surgical wing and sat in a plastic chair outside the OR where Cobb had been taken, because Emma was in there and he was going to be there when she came out. He sat with his back against the wall and his legs extended and his eyes open and his mind running through the day in the specific involuntary loop that combat experience produces. Not trauma exactly, more like an audit. The mind reviewing the record to check for errors, for decisions that could have been different, for the moments where something else might have produced a different result. He found several. He always found several. That was the nature of the audit. It was thorough, and thoroughness was not comforting. Marsh found him at 1231 and sat in the adjacent chair without being asked. NCIS is sending a team, Marsh said. I heard it from the comm sergeant. They're flying in from theater headquarters. NCIS. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Not the internal review process that Hargrove had implied. An independent investigative body with its own chain of command and its own authority. Someone had made a call faster than expected. When? Ethan asked. Tonight. They want the principals available for interview tomorrow morning. Principals meaning me. And others. Marsh paused. Apparently the intelligence package for Blackwater Valley has been flagged at a level above Colonel Hargrove's office. Someone above Hargrove got involved in the last 2 hours. Ethan looked at the OR door. Did you catch a name? General Aldris. Brigadier General Patricia Aldris, who ran theater intelligence and who had a reputation for the specific kind of rigorous accountability that made people either respect her or avoid her, depending on what they had to hide. Ethan had never met her. He'd heard her name from officers who respected her and from officers who were afraid of her, and in his experience, that distribution was a reliable indicator of someone worth trusting. Good, he said. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Sir, the transmission, the voice. He paused, choosing his words. I've been thinking about it. The timing. How they knew which frequency Emma was using. Yeah. Emma set up that radio herself before she left. Marsh looked at him. She used a personal protocol, not standard military assignment, a frequency she selected, which means whoever accessed it either had her radio spec sheet or had been monitoring her communications from the start. Ethan had thought about this on the aircraft. He'd been trying not to think about it since. Or someone told them. Someone who knew Emma was going. Someone who knew Emma was going, who she is, and what radio she'd use. Marsh sat with that. How many people knew she was in the mountains? When I found out she was coming, I knew. You knew because you were on the radio. Reeve heard me relay the information to Reeves. He paused. And whoever was listening to our tactical radio network, which is encrypted. Which is encrypted, Ethan agreed, unless someone had the keys. The OR door opened. Emma came out wearing scrubs that weren't hers, her hair pulled back, still favoring her left leg. She had the specific blankness of expression that surgeons and trauma medics wear after a long procedure. Not empty, more like a face that has been asked to do too many things and has temporarily suspended its optional functions. She saw Ethan and stopped. He stood up. He's out, she said. Surgery went... She paused, choosing the word as well as it could. The bleeding was worse than my field assessment. They found a secondary injury I didn't catch. She said this last part flatly, as a fact, absorbing the information she was delivering rather than delivering it for sympathy. He's in recovery. They think he'll make it. Emma. I should have caught the secondary injury. You were managing 22 patients under fire. That's not... She stopped. Looked at him. Whatever she was going to say next, she didn't say. She looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. He's going to make it. Because you got him here. She was quiet. You got all of them here, he said. The ones who made it. You're why. She looked at him with the expression she'd been using for the last 30 years when he said something she accepted but wasn't ready to fully take in. How are you doing? I don't know yet. She nodded. That was an acceptable answer. She lowered herself into the chair Marsh had vacated. Marsh had stepped away with the quiet tact he displayed in situations that required it, and Ethan sat back down beside her. They were quiet for a while. The hospital around them was active in its muted way. The sounds of equipment, of people moving purposefully, of a facility doing what facilities do when the cost of the day's work arrives at their doors. The debrief, Emma said eventually. How did it go? NCIS is coming. She looked at him. That escalated fast. Someone above Hargrove got involved. Who? Aldris. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, Aldris worked the Rendell inquiry 2 years ago. The contractor fraud case. I know. She doesn't close investigations without consequences. I know. Emma looked at her hands. They were still, which he knew took effort after a procedure. The adrenaline had nowhere to go and the hands were where it showed. The valley was planned, Ethan. That wasn't a local operation. Someone in the intelligence chain knew where you were going and when. Someone made decisions about what information you'd have when you got there. I know. That means someone in your chain of command. I know, Emma. She stopped, looked at him. He looked back. 23 dead. A satellite transmission on a restricted frequency. An intelligence package that had been assessed and redrafted and cleared by people who had names and ranks and offices. What do you need from me? She asked. Your account of the approach, your medical log from the field, and, he paused, your radio protocol. What frequency you chose and why. She looked at him steadily. You think they were tracking me? I think someone knew which frequency you'd use and accessed it. She was quiet for several seconds, processing this the way she processed things, without visible alarm, running the implications backward through the timeline. Before I left, I filed a movement report with the Navy medical liaison at the FOB routine. It included my radio protocol as a contact method. Who has access to those reports? Liaison officer, his supervisor, whoever they share it up the chain with. She paused. Which could be a lot of people. Could be. He held her gaze. Or it could be a specific person. She looked at the OR door, at the door behind which Ray Cobb was recovering because she'd gotten to him in time. The same specific person who cleared your patrol route. He didn't answer. She didn't need him to. What? At 1400, Colonel Hargrove appeared in the hospital corridor. He came alone, which was unusual, and he found Ethan with the specific directional certainty of someone who'd been told exactly where to look. Commander. He stopped in front of them. He looked at Emma briefly, then back at Ethan. I wanted to speak with you before this evening. Ethan stood. Emma stayed seated. Ms. Vance has been asked to suspend her duties pending review, Hargrove said. His voice was careful in the way of a man reading from a prepared position. Her access to the intelligence distribution network has been revoked pending the investigation. Ethan waited. The intelligence package for Blackwater Valley is under forensic review. Specifically, the source assessments and the decision chain that downgraded the 5-day prior reporting. He paused. We've identified 2 instances where the reporting was reviewed and reclassified from probable to unverified. Both reclassifications occurred within 48 hours of your patrol order being finalized. Both reclassifications were in Vance's office. Hargrove didn't answer directly. The investigation will determine the specifics. What about the satellite transmission? That's being traced. The frequency origin is being analyzed. He paused. What I can tell you is that whoever sent it had access to information about your tactical situation in real time. That access is being investigated as a potential second breach. Second breach. Meaning they'd already identified a first. Sir? Ethan kept his voice level. Are you telling me that someone in the intelligence chain actively suppressed threat reporting before my unit was sent into that valley? Hargrove looked at him. The careful posture was still there, but something behind it had shifted. The specific change in a man's face when he's decided that the managed version of a conversation has reached its limit. I'm telling you that the preliminary review has raised serious questions about the integrity of the assessment process. I'm telling you that General Aldris is personally overseeing the investigation, and I am telling you, he paused, and this pause was different from his earlier ones, that your filed statement and Corporal Marsh's log are now part of a record that cannot be altered or suppressed. Awesome. He looked at Ethan with something that might have been, in a man less guarded, an apology. I should have asked about casualties, Hargrove said. When you landed, I should have asked immediately. Ethan looked at him. Yes, sir, you should have. Hargrove held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away down the corridor. Emma watched him go. He knew, she said quietly. He knew something was wrong with the assessment before we went in. And he sent you anyway. He may not have had the authority to stand the patrol down. The order came from above his level. Ethan watched the end of the corridor where Hargrove had turned. Or he had the authority and didn't use it. Which is it? That's what Aldris is going to find out. Emma was quiet. Then, what about the transmission, the voice? Do you think they'll find who it was? I think whoever sent it wanted us to find them. Eventually. He sat back down. They gave us enough to start pulling the thread. They didn't give us enough to make it easy. He paused. Which means they're careful. And they've been watching for a while. Watching you? Watching the situation. He looked at the OR door again, at the plain fact of it, the door, the building, the fact of being alive in front of it. Someone knew the ambush was being planned. Someone had enough access to know about Vance's reclassifications, and they chose the middle of a firefight to make first contact. Why then? Because after, he said, there would be narratives in place, official accounts, investigation structures that someone had already started managing. He looked at her. During was the only moment when the information was still mine to receive without interference. Emma was quiet for a long moment. The hospital moved around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped steadily. Someone's protecting themselves, she said finally, from whatever Vance's office did, or didn't do. Or someone's protecting something larger and using us to surface it. She looked at him. That's a different kind of problem. Yes. She leaned her head back against the wall. He leaned his head back against the wall. They sat together in the specific, exhausted silence of people who had been through something that hadn't finished being what it was. At 1447, Marsh appeared at the end of the corridor. He was moving with purpose, the particular walk that meant he had information that wasn't going to wait. He stopped in front of them and looked at Ethan. NCIS arrived early, he said. They're in Building 4 now. And sir, he paused. They didn't come alone. There's a JAG team with them, 4 attorneys. Emma sat up. And there's a civilian, Marsh continued. Male, mid-50s, came in on a separate vehicle. He's not identified himself to anyone on base yet, but the NCIS agent in charge met him at the vehicle, and they spoke for about 2 minutes before coming in. Ethan stood. What does he look like? Emma asked. Marsh looked at her, then at Ethan. Civilian clothes, calm, moving like he knows exactly where he is and exactly what he's doing here. He paused. Like he's been inside this kind of situation before. Ethan looked at his sister. She looked back at him. The orders that put you in this valley were not clean. You should know that before the rescue narrative gets written without you. The voice on the satellite radio, the measured cadence of someone who had chosen his moment carefully, who had picked a restricted frequency, who had known Emma's radio protocol, who had been watching the situation long enough to know when to speak. The man in the civilian clothes had arrived in a separate vehicle, had been met privately by the lead investigator, had not identified himself to anyone on base. But he was here, which meant he'd wanted to be found eventually by the right people. Ethan straightened his jacket, looked at Marsh. Where's he now? Building 4, waiting room. Then let's go, Ethan said. Building 4 had a waiting room that was designed for waiting in the bureaucratic sense. Plastic chairs, a water cooler that made a sound every 40 seconds, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything it touched. The kind of room that communicated, through its specific indifference to human comfort, that whatever happened inside it was serious and whatever happened to the people inside it was secondary. The man was sitting in the far corner, mid-50s, as Marsh had said. Civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray jacket that had been worn enough to lose its shape, the kind of clothing that people who travel constantly wear because it packs well and doesn't declare anything. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his back straight, not tensed, just the posture of someone who had learned to be still in rooms where other people were uncomfortable. He looked up when Ethan came in. Their eyes met across the room. The man didn't stand immediately, which was itself a message, not disrespect, more like he was letting Ethan set the pace. He looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific person and is now confirming that the specific person has arrived. Then he stood. Commander Walker. His voice was the one from the satellite radio, measured, precise. Without the static, it was older than it had sounded, and more tired. You sent the transmission, Ethan said. Yes. Emma had come in behind him. The man looked at her and something in his face moved. Not surprise, more like recognition of a variable he'd accounted for. Lieutenant Commander Walker, I know your work. The Fallujah triage protocol you developed in 2019 is in the Navy's field medicine curriculum. Emma looked at him. Who are you? He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials wallet. He held it open for them without walking toward them, letting them come to it. Ethan crossed the room and looked. Defense Intelligence Agency, Senior Operations Analyst. The name on the credential was Gerald Foss. "You're DIA," Ethan said. "Retired, technically. I came back on a contract basis 14 months ago for a specific project." He put the credentials away. The project involved monitoring a network of intelligence manipulation that had been operating within theater assessment teams for approximately 3 years. Ethan looked at him steadily. "Vance. Vance is part of it. She's not the center." He looked at the door, then at Marsh, who was standing near it. "Is there somewhere we can speak that isn't a waiting room?" "Ye imamaki. Ye bismamaki." The conference room they found, smaller than the one Hargrove had used, no aide, no whiteboard, held 4 people. Ethan, Emma, Marsh, and Gerald Foss. Foss sat across from Ethan and placed a thin folder on the table between them. He didn't open it immediately. 3 years ago, Foss said, a series of intelligence assessments in this theater began showing a pattern. Specific threat reports from human intelligence sources, from SIGINT, from partner nation reporting were being downgraded below their warranted confidence levels. Not all reports. Selected ones, in selected geographic areas, on selected timelines. Selected to benefit whom? Emma asked. At first we thought it was contractor fraud. Companies with financial interests in specific operational areas were the initial hypothesis. He paused. It's more complicated than that. There are private security firms with contracts that activate under specific threat conditions. If the official assessment says an area is low threat, those contracts don't activate. If it says high threat, they do. Some of those contracts are worth considerable money. Someone was keeping assessments low to suppress contract activations, Ethan said. We're doing the inverse. Suppressing threat data to allow operations that the true threat picture would have prevented and then activating private security contracts in the aftermath when the situation had escalated to the point where they were justified. Foss looked at him. Blackwater Valley was both. The patrol was allowed to proceed using suppressed intelligence. The escalation that followed has already triggered 3 private security contracts for the region, totaling approximately $47 million over 2 years. The room was quiet. Ethan looked at the folder on the table. Who benefits from the contracts? The contracts route through 2 firms registered in Delaware and 1 in Cyprus. The ownership structures are layered. Foss opened the folder for the first time, revealing a single printed page with names and financial flow notations. He slid it across the table. We've traced the beneficial ownership to 4 individuals. 2 are civilian contractors currently embedded in theater intelligence infrastructure. 1 is a retired general officer with consulting relationships to both firms. He paused. The 4th is currently an active duty colonel. Ethan looked at the page. The names were there. Actual names, specific, documented. The 4th name was not Hargrove. He looked up. This colonel? Where is he now? He was at Keller Forward this morning, actually. He left approximately 40 minutes before your aircraft landed. Foss held Ethan's gaze. Colonel Richard Saab. He was the officer who finalized your patrol order. Ethan sat with that. Richard Saab, whom he had met once at a command conference 8 months ago, who had the kind of unremarkable presence that certain ambitious men cultivate deliberately, who had shaken Ethan's hand and said something forgettable about operational readiness. The patrol order, Ethan said. He finalized it with the suppressed intelligence. He finalized it after personally reviewing and approving the assessment that downgraded the 5-day prior Ridge reporting. Foss closed the folder. The documentation is complete. We have the revision history on the digital assessment file, the access log showing who touched it and when, and 3 years of financial records connecting the contract activations to the threat suppression pattern. Then why are you here talking to me? Emma asked. Why isn't this already done? Foss looked at her. Because documentation that sits inside a classified network can be disputed, reclassified, or made to disappear by the right people with the right access. What cannot be disputed is a first-person account from the commanding officer of the unit that was sent into the compromised operation, filed formally, on record, with an independent investigative body. He looked at Ethan. Your statement today and Corporal Marsh's log are now part of the NCIS record, which is not a classified network. which is a criminal investigative process with its own chain of custody and its own legal standards. You needed our testimony to anchor the financial evidence. I needed your testimony to make the financial evidence unchallengeable. He leaned forward slightly. The men who designed this system are good at operating inside classified environments. They've been doing it for 3 years, and they know how to make things disappear. But they cannot make a criminal investigation disappear. They cannot reclassify a dead Marine. The word landed in the room the way it was meant to. 23, Ethan said. 23, Foss agreed. He said it with the weight of a man who had been carrying the numbers since before today. I've been working this case for 14 months. I knew the threat suppression was occurring. I did not know which specific operation they would use as the activation event. His voice was even, but something in it cost him something. I was working toward exposure before they acted. I didn't get there in time. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The transmission. During the firefight, you were watching in real time. I had access to the satellite uplink network that Emma's radio was using. I'd flagged her movement report when I saw the name. I'd been monitoring everyone connected to your unit as a precaution. Misatriz Tumal, he paused. When I saw the situation developing, I made a decision. I could wait until the investigation was formalized and approach you through channels that some of the people I was investigating had access to. Or I could reach you directly, in the moment when you were the most unmanageable version of yourself. What's my son? Unmanageable. You were in a firefight. You were not going to be managed by anyone's narrative. Anything I told you, you were going to remember exactly as it happened. He looked at Ethan steadily. I needed you to know, before the debrief, before the official account got written around you, that what happened in that valley wasn't a failure of planning or a bad luck ambush. I needed you to walk into that conference room with Hargrove knowing what you were actually dealing with. Emma was watching Foss with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to trust something. You put him at risk, broadcasting on that frequency during an active engagement. I know. If the enemy element had been monitoring that frequency, they weren't. I confirmed the frequency was clean before I transmitted. He looked at her. I understand that's not adequate reassurance after the fact. I made a judgment call with incomplete information under time pressure. I make those calls. Sometimes they're wrong. He held her gaze. Today it wasn't wrong. Emma held his gaze. Didn't agree with him. Didn't disagree. Let it sit. The NCIS team came in at 1600. Special Agent in Charge Dana Kerrigan was a woman in her late 40s who moved with the specific economy of someone who wasted nothing. Not words, not motion, not attention. She sat across from Ethan with 2 agents flanking her, a recorder running, and the folder Foss had brought laid open in front of her because Foss had handed it to her in the hallway, and she'd read it in the time it took to walk from the entrance to the conference room. Commander Walker, she said, I want to start with the intelligence package from the beginning. He told her. He had been telling it in versions all day. To Hargrove, to Foss, to himself in the ongoing audit that his mind was running. And this version was the clearest because he was the least shocked by it now and could deliver it in the chronological, specific, evidence-anchored way that an investigator needed. He went through the patrol order, the Saigon age, the river crossing data, the ridge assessment gap, the 5-day prior reporting that had been downgraded. He laid his copy of the patrol order on the table. He walked through the timeline of contact in the valley. He gave her Marsh's log. Kerrigan listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise and specific, all of them aimed at establishing causation rather than description. Then she looked at Emma. Lieutenant Commander Walker, your movement report. Filed with the Navy Medical Liaison the night before the incident. Yes. Who did you file it with specifically? Liaison Officer Lieutenant Greer. Routine procedure for independent medical assets moving into operational areas. Lieutenant Greer's supervisor at the time of your filing was Colonel Saab's operations officer. Kerrigan said this without inflection, as a fact. Your movement report, including your radio protocol, was shared up the chain as standard administrative practice. It would have reached Colonel Saab's office within 4 hours of filing. Emma was quiet for a moment. And from there to anyone he chose to share it with, That's what we're establishing, yes. Kerrigan made a note. The transmission Commander Walker received during the engagement was traced this afternoon. The uplink point was a satellite communications node at a civilian facility 40 kilometers from Keller Forward. The facility has a contract with a company registered in Delaware. She paused. The same Delaware company in Mr. Foss's documentation. Foss, sitting against the wall, said nothing. The node was accessed using credentials belonging to a retired DIA signals officer who has been flagged in Mr. Foss's investigation as a peripheral associate of the network. Kerrigan looked at Foss. You didn't send the transmission. No, Foss said. I facilitated the access. Someone else made the transmission. Who? Foss looked at the table. The retired signals officer is someone I've been working with for 8 months. His name is Thomas Ray. He had personal reasons for wanting this network exposed. A pause. His son was in a convoy that was routed through a compromised assessment zone 14 months ago. 4 men were killed. His son was one of them. The room held this. He's been building the financial documentation from the inside, Foss continued. He has access I don't have. He made the call during the firefight because he was monitoring and he determined that Commander Walker was the right person to receive the information at that moment. He looked at Ethan. He was the voice you heard. He's been trying to get to this point for 14 months, since his son. Ethan looked at the recorder on the table, at the running light on it, at the permanence of the spoken word once it existed in a device that was part of a criminal record. He thought about Thomas Ray, whoever he was, sitting at a satellite node 40 kilometers away, watching a tactical situation unfold in real time, making a decision about when to speak and what to say to a man he'd never met because the 14 months of preparation had arrived at the specific moment that required action. He thought about a father and a son. He didn't say anything about it. Where is Ray now? Kerrigan asked. Safe, Foss said. He's been under my protective arrangement for the last 6 weeks. When the investigation concludes, he'll testify formally. Kerrigan nodded once. She looked at Ethan. Colonel Saab was apprehended at 15:30 today at the transit hub at Bagram. He had a flight booked under a civilian passport. She let that sit for a second. He's in custody. The 2 civilian contractors and Foss's documentation were detained this morning by a parallel DIA action that I'm not table reading today. The retired general officer surrendered to federal authorities at his residence in Virginia at 1400 Eastern. The sequence of it, the coordinated, simultaneous nature of the detentions, landed with a weight that Ethan hadn't been prepared for. He'd been moving all day from moment to moment, from crisis to crisis, from debrief to corridor to waiting room, and the forward momentum had kept the larger picture at a distance. Now it was in the room. It's over, Emma said. Not a question. The criminal phase is beginning, Kerrigan said, which is different from over. There will be proceedings. There will be lawyers and delays, and the specific institutional difficulty of prosecuting people who operated inside classified systems. She looked at them without softening what she was saying. But the core of the network is contained. The documentation is in federal custody, and the chain of evidence is intact. She paused. Because you filed your statement. Because Corporal Marsh's log exists. Because you walked into that debrief with Hargrove knowing what you were dealing with. Ethan looked at Marsh, who was in the corner, who had been in the corner all day, who had kept his radio and kept his log and kept his composure through 4.5 hours of firefight and whatever this afternoon had been. Marsh met his eyes, said nothing, which was enough. Colonel Saab's formal charges were filed the following morning. Dereliction of duty, conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, and involuntary manslaughter, 23 counts. The manslaughter charge had been recommended by the JAG team based on the documented deliberate suppression of threat reporting that had directly resulted in the deaths of the Marines in Blackwater Valley. It was not a charge typically applied in military intelligence cases. It was applied here because the documentation made the causal chain unchallengeable. The civilian contractors were charged federally. The retired general officer entered a cooperation agreement with prosecutors within 48 hours, which the federal attorneys described as the fastest cooperation agreement they had seen in a case of this type, which said something about what the documentation contained. Vance was charged with conspiracy and obstruction. She did not cooperate. Thomas Ray gave his formal deposition to NCYS 6 days after the Valley. Ethan was not present for it. He read a summary. In the summary, Ray described 14 months of work conducted in grief that had calcified into purpose, the specific transformation that happens when loss becomes the only remaining form of motion. He described his son. He described the convoy. He described the assessment that had sent the convoy through terrain that had been flagged as dangerous and cleared as safe by a process that had been corrupted at its root. Ethan read the summary in a room in the hospital building, sitting in the same plastic chair where he'd waited for Emma to come out of surgery. He read it once. He didn't read it again. Ray Cobb was transferred to a surgical facility in Germany on day 3. Emma flew with him. She had argued against this initially. Her presence wasn't medically necessary at that point. The receiving team was more than capable. She had other responsibilities. She had made this argument to herself, standing in the hospital corridor, and had then gone to the flight coordinator and arranged to be on the aircraft. She sat beside his gurney for the flight, working on field reports with a tablet on her knee, occasionally checking his monitors in the automatic way of someone whose attention never fully leaves a patient. At some point over the Mediterranean, he woke up enough to be aware of her. "You're still here," he said. His voice was thin and rough. "Flight nurse was short-staffed," she said, not looking up from her report. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not why." She looked up. He was watching her with the particular clarity that people sometimes have when they're in pain and medicated in equal measure, honest in a way that full consciousness defends against. "No," she agreed. "That's not why." He looked at the aircraft ceiling. "My sister. Did you—" "I don't have her number." "It's—" He started to give it to her. "Cobb. You can call her yourself when we land." He was quiet. Then, "What did you say to me?" "Before they loaded me. You said something." She remembered. She had said, "You're going to be annoying to the people who love you for a very long time." It had seemed like the right thing, specific enough to be real, forward-looking, something to hold on to. "I told you that you had people waiting for you." He looked at her. "That's not quite what you said." She looked back at her report. "Get some rest." He did. She kept working. Outside the aircraft window, the sea moved below them without any of the urgency that the last 3 days had required, and she let herself look at it for a moment, just the color of it, the specific blue that has no particular name, before she went back to the page. General Aldris's formal review of the Blackwater Valley operation was completed in 11 days. Its findings: the intelligence assessment that supported the patrol order was deliberately compromised through a documented pattern of threat reporting suppression. The patrol route selected based on that assessment placed 280 Marines in a high-threat environment with inadequate intelligence support. The decisions made by the commanding officer on the ground, the immediate tactical adaptations, the river crossing, the perimeter management, the ammunition redistribution, were assessed as sound and appropriate given the information available. The performance of the medical personnel, specifically the independent Navy combat medic who entered the operational area alone and without authorization, was assessed as directly contributing to the survival of multiple Marines who would otherwise have been expected to die of their wounds before extraction. The review recommended a formal commendation for Ethan Walker. It recommended a separate formal commendation for Emma Walker, and additionally recommended that her field triage protocol, the specific sequence of decisions she had made in managing 22 simultaneous casualties under combat conditions with limited supplies, be documented and incorporated into Navy combat medicine training. Ethan read the review in a room at Keller Forward. He read it carefully, the way he read important documents, without hurrying. He found the sections about his tactical decisions and read those with the critical eye of someone who knows his own choices better than any reviewer does, noting the places where the assessment was generous and the places where it was probably right. He found the section about Emma and read it twice. He called her when he finished. She picked up on the second ring. She was back in her unit at her regular posting because she had returned there after the Germany transfer, because there was work to do, and she was someone who returned to work. "Have you read it?" he asked. "The review? Yes." "The curriculum recommendation. I saw it." "Emma, it's a recommendation. It doesn't mean—" "It means they're putting your protocol in the curriculum." She was quiet for a moment. "I was just doing what the situation required. That's the protocol." She didn't answer immediately. He could hear, in the background of her end, the specific ambient sounds of a medical facility, voices, equipment, the indifferent hum of a place that was always doing something. She was at work. She would always be at work. "How are you doing?" she asked. Honest answer? Obviously. He leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above him had a flicker in it, slight, almost imperceptible, just enough to be noticed by someone sitting still long enough to notice things. "I keep running through it. The decisions, the ones that cost something." "That's normal." "I know." "It doesn't stop being normal even when you know." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "Ortega, the engineer who went into the river." She waited. "I keep thinking about whether the crossing sequence could have been different. If I'd sent the engineers differently—" "Stop." He stopped. "You made decisions under fire with incomplete information while managing a compound tactical crisis. Some of those decisions saved lives. Some of the lives you lost would have been lost regardless of the decision." Her voice was even. "You know this. You're going to know it and still do the thing your brain does, which is replay it. That's going to happen for a while." "Yeah." "Talk to someone, not me. A professional someone." "You're a medical professional. I'm your sister. It's not the same thing and you know it." A pause. "Promise me." He looked at the flickering light. "I'll make an appointment. This week." "Emma." "This week, Ethan." "Fine. This week." He paused. "The commendation recommendation. Are you going to accept it?" A long pause from her end, long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I don't know yet." "You should. It feels—" She stopped, started again. "It feels complicated to be recognized for something that happened because other people didn't come home." He understood that. He understood it in the specific way that only applies to people who've been in the position of being alive when others aren't. It's not either or. The recognition doesn't cancel the loss. It just means the thing you did gets recorded accurately. She was quiet. "The men who designed the system that put us there," he said, "they're going to spend the next several years arguing in courtrooms that what they did was defensible, that the intelligence failures were procedural, not criminal, that the deaths were an unfortunate outcome of an imperfect system." He held the phone. "The accurate record is the thing they can't argue with. Your protocol in the curriculum. My testimony on file. Marcia's log. Cobb calling his sister." He paused. "That's what accurate looks like." She was quiet for a long moment. The background sounds of her facility continued. The hum, the voices, the indifferent work of a place that didn't stop because any individual conversation was happening inside it. "Okay," she said. "Okay, you'll accept it?" "Okay, I understand what you're saying." A pause. "I'll think about the commendation." "Emma." "I'll think about it seriously. That's the best I can give you right now." He knew when to stop pushing. "That's fine." They were quiet for a moment. The comfortable quiet of people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't require filling. "Cobb's sister called me," Emma said. "What?" "He gave her my number, from the hospital in Germany." A brief pause. "She called to say thank you. I didn't know what to say, so I talked to her for a while. About him. She told me about when he was a kid. Apparently he was terrified of dogs until he was 12, which she found extremely funny." Something in her voice shifted, not quite lighter, more like a specific kind of emotion that doesn't have a clean name. "She's going to fly to Germany to be there when he moves to the rehabilitation unit." Ethan looked at the ceiling, at the light that flickered. "Good," he said. "Yeah." A pause. "Good." 6 weeks after Blackwater Valley, Ethan Walker stood in front of a review board at theater headquarters and gave a formal account of the engagement, the debrief, and the subsequent investigation. He had done this before: formal boards, formal language, the specific discipline of military accountability that requires precision without emotion. He had always found it manageable. This one was different. This one had 23 names attached to it, and a judge advocate who had asked him, early in the proceeding, to confirm that his account was accurate and complete to the best of his knowledge. He had confirmed it, The board lasted 4 hours. When it concluded, the presiding officer, a rear admiral named Hollis, whom Ethan had never met, said something that Ethan had not expected and did not know how to process in the moment, which was that the actions of Ethan's command in Blackwater Valley represented the kind of decision-making under impossible conditions that military leadership doctrine was designed to produce, and that the 23 who had not come home had died in service of a mission that had been compromised before it began by people who had treated their lives as acceptable variables in a financial calculation. Hollis said this on the record. He said it looking directly at Ethan. Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and his face as controlled as he could make it, which was not entirely controlled, and he said, "Thank you, sir," which was inadequate, which was all he had. Thomas Ray's deposition became part of the federal prosecution record in the case against Colonel Richard Saab. At the first pretrial hearing, Saab's attorney argued that the intelligence decisions in question were made within established procedural frameworks and did not constitute criminal conduct. The judge reviewed the documentation, the revision history, the access logs, the 3 years of financial records, the financial connections between the threat suppression pattern and the contract activations, and denied the motion to dismiss. The trial was scheduled for the following year. Ethan was not required to attend. He intended to anyway. The commendation ceremony for Emma Walker was held at her unit's base in early autumn. It was a small ceremony, not a parade, not a large formation, the kind of military recognition that happens in a room with the relevant people present and a record made of it. Ethan flew in the night before. He sat in the second row, in civilian clothes, because he was off duty and because Emma had specifically requested that he not make it a thing. He made it somewhat of a thing. He brought Marsh, who had not been invited but who appeared anyway, which Emma had looked at him about and then accepted. The citation read by the presiding officer included the specific clinical details of what Emma had done in the valley, the patient count, the interventions, the conditions, the outcomes. It was thorough in the way that military citations are thorough when someone has taken the time to write them accurately, rather than in the standard shorthand. Emma stood and received it with the posture of someone who was accepting it on behalf of a situation rather than for herself, which was, Ethan thought, approximately correct. When she sat back down, the empty chair beside her, which was where she'd been, Ethan leaned over. "You should look more pleased," he said quietly. She looked straight ahead. "I'm trying. Try harder." She turned her head and looked at him with the expression she'd been using since they were children, the one that covered approximately 12 distinct emotions in a single look. "Thank you for coming," she said. Obviously. She looked forward again. The ceremony was continuing. Other recognitions, other names, the ordinary machinery of institutional acknowledgement doing what it does. He sat beside her and watched it and didn't say anything else. After, standing outside in the autumn light, Marsh produced coffee from somewhere, a thermos, which he distributed with the practical forethought that had made him excellent at his job. And the three of them stood together in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Emma looked at the sky. It was clear. The particular clear of early autumn when the air has finally decided to behave like autumn air, cool enough to notice, but not uncomfortable. "Cobb starts outpatient rehab next week," she said. "How's the prognosis?" "Good. Better than good, actually. The surgical team in Germany was excellent." She held her coffee. "He's going to have a scar that he'll probably tell stories about." "Will the stories be accurate?" "Probably not." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, adjacent. "The accurate version is better, but the stories he'll tell will be more entertaining." Ethan looked at the sky alongside her. "That's usually how it works." Marsh drank his coffee and said nothing, which was the right contribution. The light was moving across the base in the specific way that autumn light moves, slower than summer light, at a lower angle, casting longer shadows that reach further than they seem like they should. Ethan watched it move across the concrete. 23 men were not here to stand in this light. They would not stand in any light that followed this one. He was going to carry that, not as a wound exactly, more as a weight that becomes part of the posture of a life, something you adjust to without eliminating, something you bring with you everywhere because there is no place that doesn't come with you. He would testify at the trial. He would make the appointment his sister had asked him to make. He would write letters to 23 families, not the form letters that the military provided, his own letters, specific and honest, because the families deserved specific and honest, and he was the one who owed it to them. He would command again. Not here, probably not in this theater. The review board had discussions ahead of it about his next assignment, conversations that suggested broader advisory and training roles, which he had complicated feelings about and had not yet resolved. He would resolve them. He was someone who resolved things. Emma drank her coffee. Marsh drank his. The autumn light continued its slow movement across the base. And somewhere in Germany, in a rehabilitation facility, Ray Cobb was making a phone call to Atlanta at a time of his own choosing. Not Sunday morning, his sister's hour, but his own hour for once. Because he was still alive to have an hour of his own, which was a thing that had required other people to decide was going to be true, and then make it true through the specific, unglamorous, imperfect work of refusing to stop. That was what survival looked like, Ethan thought. Not clean, not certain, not the version that anyone would have chosen in advance, just forward, just the decision, made again and again under conditions that argued against it, to keep moving when everything said stop. The most important battles are never the ones on a map. They are the ones fought in the moment when giving up would be easier. And someone decides not to.